Before the oldest written word found its way onto clay, before the first gods received their names in temple hymns, there were hands, human hands, hands that shaped stone and pressed meaning into surfaces that would outlast empires not yet dreamed of, hands that left messages we can no longer read. In a place where desert wind has carved the earth into shapes that resemble memory itself, there stands a stone. A single stone, weathered by 10,000 rains, marked with symbols that curve and spiral across its surface like a language dreaming itself into existence. Scholars have knelt before it. They have traced its grooves with careful fingers. They have photographed it under every angle of light, compared it to every writing system ever catalogued, and still, silence. The stone keeps its secret. The symbols remain locked in a grammar that died before recorded time began. It's 36, it is said that history is written by the victors, but what of the history written before there were victors to remember? What of the civilizations that rose and fell in the long darkness before memory learned to preserve itself in words? We move now through the dust of prehistory, where the ground itself is layered with forgetting. Beneath the Sahara's endless expanse, beneath dunes that shift like breathing, archaeologists have found the ghost of a settlement. Not ruins exactly, something more subtle. Patterns in the sand revealed by satellite imaging. Structures that appear and disappear depending on how the light falls. Evidence of engineering too sophisticated for the era it supposedly belongs to, arranged with a precision that suggests not accident but intention, not survival but ceremony. The structures align with stars. Not the stars as they appear now, but as they appeared thousands upon thousands of years ago, when the Earth's slow wobble placed different constellations overhead. The ancients were tracking something, marking time perhaps, or mapping meaning onto the heavens. They built their world to mirror what they saw in the night sky, creating a conversation between Earth and cosmos that we can detect but no longer understand. Who were they? What names did they call themselves? What stories did mothers whisper to children as night fell over stone dwellings we can barely imagine? We know they existed, the evidence insists on it, but we do not know them. Their language has dissolved, their songs have returned to silence. Even their bones, if we could find them, would tell us only that they were human, not who they believed themselves to be. Humiliation, this is the uncomfortable truth that archaeology sometimes reveals. That history, as we teach it, as we understand it, began not at the beginning, but somewhere in the middle of a much longer story. The first cities we can name were not the first cities. The first writing we can read was not the first attempt to trap thought in physical form. We are entering the theatre long after the play has started, trying to reconstruct the opening act from fragments and whispers. Imagine for a moment a fire circle. It is night, perhaps 30,000 years ago, perhaps more. Around the fire, hands have been pressed against a rock wall, dozens of them, overlapping, creating a record of presence that transcends individual identity. These are not drawings of hands. These are actual hands, covered in ochre, pressed against stone, leaving their print for millennia. What ceremony was this? What did it mean to add your hand to the others? Were they marking something sacred, or was this simply the human impulse to say, I was here, I existed, remember me? The fire has long since gone cold. The people who made those prints have become dust, but the hands remain, ghostly and urgent, reaching across an abyss of time so vast it makes the fall of Rome seem like yesterday's news. In coastal regions now drowned beneath rising seas, other mysteries sleep in the deep. Entire landscapes that were once home to human communities now rest underwater. forests where children played, river valleys where crops grew, settlements that thrived during the last ice age when sea levels were hundreds of feet lower than today. We can map these drowned lands with sonar, can trace the ghost rivers that once carved through plains now oceanic. But we cannot know what cultures lived there, what they believed, what wisdom they might have possessed. Some archaeologists speak of lost eras of sophistication, periods when human knowledge reached peaks that were later buried under catastrophe, flood, earthquake, volcanic winter, or simply the slow forgetting that happens when oral traditions are interrupted. If a civilization leaves no writing, if its greatest works are built in wood that rots or knowledge passed voice to voice through generations that suddenly end, how would we ever know it existed? There are burial chambers in places you would not expect, hidden in hills that seem natural until excavation reveals they are not. Inside these chambers, objects whose purpose remains unknown. Carved stones covered in geometric patterns, metal implements of no clear function, arrangements that suggest ritual but offer no key to decode the ritual's meaning. Were these tools, toys, religious artifacts, or something we have no category for because the concept itself has been lost? The emotional weight of this realization settles slowly, like dust after wind. We think we know the story of human civilization. First came hunter-gatherers, then agriculture, then cities, then writing, then history as we recognize it. But this timeline is not quite true. It is the story of what survived, what left traces durable enough to reach us across the abyss. How much happened that left no trace? How many times did human communities achieve something remarkable, only to have it erased by time's patient hand? The deepest human past is not a timeline, but a mystery wrapped in forgetting. When we stand at what we call the beginning of history, we are really standing at a point of amnesia, looking backward into fog that grows thicker the further we peer. Somewhere in that fog, people lived entire lives, raised children, created beauty, solved problems, told stories, and died believing those stories would continue. They were wrong. The continuity broke. The thread snapped. And now we find only fragments, a carved stone, aligned ruins, ghostly handprints, submerged coastlines. Perhaps civilization itself is older than memory. Perhaps we are walking through ruins we cannot see, because time has ground them to dust, or the jungle has swallowed them, or the sea has pulled them under. Perhaps the words we speak, the songs we sing, the symbols we recognize as ancient. Perhaps their roots stretch back into a silence we will never breach, connecting us to ancestors whose names are gone, but whose blood still moves through our veins. There is something humbling in this, something that softens the arrogance of modernity. We are not the pinnacle standing on a pyramid of progress. We are one moment in a story so long that most of it is invisible. Before us came others who were no less human, no less capable, no less filled with the urge to create, to mark their presence, to leave something that would outlast the fragile boundary of a single life. Psychologically, with its undeciphered symbols, still stands in the desert. The wind still moves around it. Rain still falls on its ancient surface. It holds its secret with the patience of stone, neither offering nor withholding, simply existing as evidence of a truth we can no longer fully know. History did not begin where we think it did. It began further back, in the dark, where no light of knowledge can now reach. And perhaps that is as it should be. Perhaps some mysteries are meant to remain mysterious. Some silences are meant to stay silent, reminding us that we are latecomers to a world far older and stranger than our brief moment can comprehend. The first footprint in stone was made by someone whose name we will never know, whose language we will never speak, whose dreams and fears and loves are gone. But the footprint remains. Not an answer, not a guide, just a mark, just evidence, just a whisper from the deep past saying, before you there was something, before memory there was life, before history began the world was already old. And with that knowledge we let ourselves drift towards sleep, carrying with us the weight of all that has been forgotten, all that was never recorded, all the hands that shaped the world in silence before silence itself became the only story left to tell. In the emerald darkness where sunlight arrives only in broken shafts, where the air itself seems woven from moisture and time, stone faces emerge from moss like memories surfacing through sleep. Their eyes are hollow, their expressions worn smooth by centuries of rain, and no one living can say with certainty whether they were gods or kings or something else entirely. Some role for which we no longer have a name. This is the heart of a temple complex that was already ancient when it fell silent, already forgotten when the first outsiders stumbled upon it, machetes in hand, believing themselves discoverers when they were really just the latest witnesses to a mystery that predated their arrival by 1,000 years. The jungle had reclaimed it so thoroughly that from above it appeared as nothing more than hills covered in green. Only from within, moving through the vine-covered corridors, does the truth reveal itself. This is not nature. This is architecture. This is intention carved into stone and then surrendered to the patience of roots and rain. The corridors wind in ways that suggest procession, ceremony, a sacred path meant to be walked with slow reverence. Overhead, what remains of corbelled arches lean inward like hands almost touching. Beneath your feet, though you cannot see it for the layer of soil and fallen leaves, geometric patterns are carved into the floor, creating a text written not in words, but in relationships between shapes, in the mathematics of beauty. The walls tell stories, not in any script scholars can fully decode, though they have tried. The carvings show figures in elaborate headdresses, glyphs that might be dates or names or prayers, scenes that could depict history or myth, or the place where those two categories dissolve into each other. There are processions frozen in stone, people carrying burdens or offerings, musicians with instruments, dancers mid-step in some ritual whose meaning has returned to silence. The visual language is clear enough to convey importance, but obscure enough to withhold specifics. We can see that something mattered deeply to these people. We cannot know exactly what. Psychologist execution itself poses questions that modern engineers still debate. The stones are massive, some weighing tons, cut with such precision that even now, after centuries of settling and earthquake and the relentless pressure of tree roots, you cannot slide a blade between them. They were fitted together without mortar, without the wheel, without metal tools as we understand them. The method is lost. The knowledge went wherever the builders went when they walked away from this place for the final time. And the alignment. This is where the mystery deepens into something almost mystical. The temple complex is oriented with exactitude towards celestial events that occur only once in a lifetime, once in several lifetimes. Solstices and equinoxes are marked, yes, but also the rising points of certain stars, the maximum and minimum positions of the moon's complicated dance across decades. These people were tracking patterns that required not just observation, but sustained observation across generations. They were thinking in time frames that eclipse individual human spans, creating architecture as a form of conversation with eternity. It is said that at certain moments, when the sun reaches a specific angle on a particular day, light falls through a carefully positioned opening and illuminates a carving deep within the temple's inner chambers. A serpent descends the staircase in shadow and light. A god's face emerges from darkness for exactly 7 minutes before returning to obscurity. These are not accidents. These are instruments, stone calendars, theological statements rendered in architecture. Who were the people who conceived of this? Who was the priest who first calculated these alignments, who said to the stonecutters, "Here, precisely here, the wall must stand"? Who were the artisans who spent their lives carving beauty that would outlast their names? Their hands moved over these surfaces, their breath fogged the air on cool mornings as they worked, their voices discussed the day's labor in a language that has since dissolved into the general silence from which all lost languages eventually emerge. We imagine the temple in its fullness, not as it is now, strangled by vines and half collapsed, but as it was when it lived. Smoke rising from braziers, the scent of copal resin burning in offering, murals bright with colors that have long since faded to ghosts of pigment, the sound of drums echoing off stone walls, priests in elaborate costumes moving through the corridors with the weight of sacred duty, children playing in courtyards between ceremonies, mothers carrying water from the sacred well, their footsteps wearing grooves into stairs that we can still trace with our fingers. And then, the ending. Not sudden, perhaps. These places rarely die all at once. More likely a gradual abandonment, a slow bleeding away of population and purpose. Perhaps drought made the crops fail. Perhaps disease swept through. Perhaps war or political collapse made the old ceremonies seem hollow, the old certainties less certain. Perhaps the priests who knew the deep mysteries died without adequate successors, and the knowledge began to fragment, to simplify, to fade. We imagine the last ceremony, the final procession through these corridors, now empty of the crowds that once filled them. The last offerings placed at altars that would receive no more. The last time the sacred fire was lit, the last prayer spoken in the proper form, the last moment when the temple was still a living place, still connected to the humans who built it and the cosmos they believed it reflected. And then silence. Not immediate, but eventual. The ceremonies stop, the maintenance ends. The jungle, which has been waiting at the edges with infinite patience, begins its work. A seed germinates in a crack. Roots widen the gap. Vines climb walls no one tends anymore. Birds nest in niches that once held offerings. Moisture seeps into stone, and with the passage of centuries, the very architecture begins to settle, to lean, to dream its way back toward earth. The artifacts that remain tell their own story of ending. Jade masks hidden in burial chambers, their features stylized into expressions of eternal calm. Obsidian mirrors, polished to impossible smoothness, meant to reflect not just faces but souls, truths, the hidden architecture of reality. Star charts etched into stone with such precision that modern astronomers recognize the constellations despite the gap of centuries. Each object is a fragment of consciousness, a thought that someone had and chose to preserve in physical form, not knowing whether anyone would ever understand it again. These are not just things, they are preserved intentions. The mask says, "I believe in an afterlife that requires this specific face." The mirror says, "I believe reflection reveals truth." The star chart says, I believe the heavens and earth are in conversation, and this is how I understand their language. Each artifact is an argument about the nature of reality, frozen in jade or obsidian or carved stone, waiting for someone to receive it. But who is left to receive it? The descendants of the builders, if they exist, may have forgotten this place entirely. The language has changed beyond recognition. The religious system that made these objects meaningful has dissolved or transformed into something else. The objects remain, but their full meaning has become inaccessible, locked in a context that no longer exists. This is the sorrow at the heart of ruins. Not just that buildings fall, but that entire ways of understanding the world can vanish so completely that we can hold the evidence of them in our hands and still not fully grasp what they meant to the people who made them. Twilight comes to the jungle temple as it comes everywhere. Gradual, soft, the light changing quality rather than simply dimming. In the half-darkness, the stone faces seem almost to move, shadows pooling in their eye sockets, expressions shifting with the angle of the failing light. Water drips somewhere deeper in the complex, a steady rhythm that has continued for centuries, patient and indifferent, the sound of time itself if time could be rendered audible. The jungle breathes around the temple, exhaling mist, inhaling sunlight, continuing its slow work of reclamation. Roots probe deeper into cracks. Moss spreads its soft carpet over carved glyphs. The temple is being unmade by the same forces that surround it, returning gradually to the earth from which its stones were quarried. Plumbing. Perhaps this is appropriate. Perhaps there is a rightness to the cycle, that what humans built with such care should eventually be taken back by the world, dissolved into the ongoing life of the forest. Perhaps the temple's purpose was never permanence but presence, never eternity but its own moment, now past. Some silences are too vast to ever be filled with words. This is one of them. The silence of a civilization that rose to remarkable heights of art and astronomy and architecture, then faded, leaving behind only these stones and the questions they pose. The silence of a language no longer spoken, of prayers no longer offered, of knowledge no longer held by any living mind. We leave the temple as darkness falls completely, as the jungle sounds rise, insects, birds, the distant call of something moving through undergrowth. The stone faces watch us go with their hollow eyes, neither welcoming nor forbidding, simply present in their dissolution, marks of human presence gradually returning to absence. And perhaps, as sleep approaches, we carry with us this understanding, that even the mightiest works are temporary, that even the deepest knowledge can be lost, that the jungle's breath is patient enough to swallow temples and the civilizations that built them, leaving only fragments for those who come after to puzzle over and eventually to dream about as consciousness fades toward its own nightly forgetting. In a vault beneath a museum, where footsteps echo in hallways lined with the fragments of vanished worlds, there rests a collection of clay tablets. They are small, these tablets, some no larger than a human palm, and their surfaces are covered with symbols that flow across the clay like water frozen mid-current. Elegant marks. Deliberate strokes, a script that clearly meant something, that carried weight and purpose and the full force of human intention. No living person can read them. This is not a gap in scholarship that might be filled with sufficient research. This is not a cipher waiting for the right key. This is erasure. This is the tragedy that occurs when the final speaker of a language closes their eyes for the last time, taking with them the sound of words that will never again be spoken, the meaning of symbols that will never again unlock understanding in a living mind. The tablets were discovered in what had once been a city. Now it is ruins, walls that barely rise above the desert floor, the ghost of a street grid visible only from above. Pottery shards and broken tools scattered across sand that has buried and revealed and buried again, according to the temperament of wind. In a corner of what might have been a temple or a library or a wealthy home, the architecture is too fragmentary to say with certainty. Archaeologists found these tablets stacked carefully, deliberately, as if their owner had placed them there for safekeeping before walking away. They never returned. No one returned. The city emptied, and with it went the living memory of what these symbols meant. Linguists have studied them for decades now. They have photographed every mark, measured every curve, compared the script to every known writing system from the ancient world. They find echoes. Here a symbol that resembles something from a neighboring culture. There a grammatical structure that might suggest a distant linguistic relationship. But echoes are not translations. Resemblance is not understanding. The tablets remain as opaque as they were the day they were lifted from the sand. The symbols themselves are beautiful. This much is clear even without comprehension. They possess the kind of flowing grace that comes only from long practice, from a mature writing tradition where aesthetics and meaning have become inseparable. Someone, many someones, across generations, spent time perfecting this script, developing its forms, teaching it to children who would carry it forward. It is said that you can tell much about a culture from its writing system, even when you cannot read the words. These marks suggest care. They suggest a people who valued the preservation of thought, who believed that ideas deserved to be made permanent, that there were things worth saying that should outlast the breath required to speak them. Imagine the scribe who pressed these particular tablets into being. It is night, perhaps, and lamplight flickers across a small room where clay and stylus wait. The scribe has something to record, a transaction maybe, or a prayer, a law, a poem, a record of the king's deeds, or simply a letter to someone distant. The soft clay receives the marks with perfect fidelity, each stroke deliberate, each symbol placed with the certainty of someone who knows exactly what they mean. The scribe might pause, considering how to phrase something, how to capture in these flowing marks a thought that exists first as something wordless, something felt. And then the solution comes, and the stylus moves again, and meaning flows from mind through hand into clay, where it will harden and persist for thousands of years. But persist as what? As meaning, or merely as mark? The distinction is everything. We imagine, too, the child learning this script for the first time. Perhaps in sand, as children often do, tracing the shapes under the guidance of a patient teacher. The symbols would have seemed strange at first, arbitrary, but gradually they would resolve into sense. This mark means water. This combination means sky. Together, they create something new, rain perhaps, or tears, or the sacred rivers that the gods supposedly traveled in boats of light. The child grows. The symbols become second nature. Eventually, this former student might become the teacher, might guide another generation of small hands learning to transform thought into mark, sound into permanence. And somewhere in the life of this language, there were ceremonies. Imagine an elder standing before a gathering, intoning words in this lost tongue, performing rituals whose meaning was carried not just in action, but in the specific sounds of specific syllables arranged in sacred order. The language itself was part of the ceremony, not just a vehicle for meaning, but meaning itself, sound that had power, words that could bridge the distance between human and divine. All of this is gone now. The cosmology that this language encoded, its particular way of categorizing reality, its grammatical structures that shaped how thought could flow, dissolved. The love songs sung in this tongue, with their particular metaphors and rhythms, returned to silence. The legal codes, which surely existed, with their careful distinctions and definitions, lost all authority when no one remained who could invoke them. The jokes, the wordplay, the puns that must have existed. All humour dies when the language that carried it dies. The prayers are perhaps the most profound loss. These people, whoever they were, spoke to their gods in this language. They phrased their hopes and fears and gratitude in these specific sounds. If those gods were listening, if anything was listening, it heard this and not something else. And now that particular sound is gone from the universe. That specific way of addressing the sacred has been erased. This is not merely an academic loss. This is not just missing data. Every language is a unique lens through which consciousness filters reality. When a language dies, a way of seeing dies with it. The world becomes slightly less various, slightly more monotone. The human conversation with itself becomes quieter, missing a voice that could have said things no other voice could say in quite the same way. We consider other examples, because this tragedy is not unique. There are languages that survived only in place names. The original speakers gone, but their word for river or mountain or sacred grove still used by the people who displaced them, often without knowing what the word originally meant. There are scripts carved on single stones, found in isolation, their context lost, their language unknown. Entire oral traditions were interrupted by conquest or plague, and when the chain of memory broke, so did the language that carried it. The linear A script of ancient Crete remains undeciphered. Etruscan, spoken in Italy before Rome rose to dominance, is only partially understood. The Indus Valley script, from one of history's great civilizations, is still opaque despite decades of computational analysis. Rongo from Easter Island, Olmec from Mesoamerica, dozens of others, each one a door that is locked and we have no key. Sometimes we have the key, but have lost the language itself. We can read ancient Sumerian because scholars eventually decoded cuneiform, but no one knows how it actually sounded. The vowels are guessed at, the pronunciation is theoretical. We have the meaning, but have lost the music, the actual sonic reality of the world's first written language. The philosophical weight of this settles slowly, like silt in still water. Human consciousness, in all its forms across all of history, has produced thousands of languages, each one a complete system for meaning-making, each one capable of expressing the full range of human experience. Most of them are gone now. Most of the ways humans have chosen to organize sound into sense have returned to silence. And with each extinction, we lose not just words but concepts. Some languages have words for states of being or relationships that cannot be precisely translated into other languages. When those languages die, those concepts become harder to think, harder to name, eventually perhaps impossible to recover, because the linguistic framework that made them obvious is gone. The tablets in their vault wait in darkness. Climate-controlled, carefully preserved, they are physically safe in a way they never were when they lived in the ancient world. But they are also profoundly dead. They have become artifacts rather than texts, objects rather than messages. They are marks without meaning, symbols divorced from the system that gave them sense. Pank, perhaps somewhere in those marks is a message that would change how we understand the ancient world. Perhaps there is a poem that would be counted among humanity's greatest if only we could read it. Perhaps there is a philosophical insight, a mathematical breakthrough, a historical account that would answer questions we still puzzle over. Blindness, and this is equally possible. The tablets contain mundane things. Shopping lists, tax records, complaints about neighbors. The everyday business of human life, deemed important enough to record but not particularly profound. Perhaps we will never know. The last reader died millennia ago. The last person who could have taught the script to a new student is dust. The last conversation in this language happened so long ago that even the memory of memory has faded. The tablets remain patient and silent. They do not know they are unreadable. They do not mourn their own incomprehensibility. They simply are, marks in clay, holding their secrets close like seeds that will never find soil, like songs that will never again find voice, like questions posed to a future that arrived but cannot answer. And perhaps, as sleep approaches, we carry with us this gentle grief, that meaning is fragile, that human achievement can be undone not by catastrophe, but simply by time and forgetting. That entire worlds of thought and sound have dissolved into the silence from which they came, leaving only these mute witnesses, tablets and stones and fragments, that insist something was here, something mattered, but cannot tell us what or why or how. Playback is dark, the tablets wait, and the silence that surrounds them is not empty but full of everything that was said and can never be heard again, full of the weight of all the words that have returned to the wordless, full of languages sleeping their final sleep, dreaming perhaps of the voices that once gave them life and will never wake them again. High in mountains where the air grows thin and sacred, where breath comes short and thought comes slow, ruins cling to cliffsides like memories refusing to let go. This is a city that should not exist, a city built in a place so remote, so inhospitable, that its very presence poses questions modern minds struggle to answer with certainty. We ascend slowly. There is no other way. The path is ancient, older than empire, older than the names we give to ages. It was carved into living rock by hands that understood stone as a language, by minds that conceived of permanence in a way we have perhaps forgotten. The pathway spirals upward, switchbacking across faces of cliff that drop away into depths where clouds gather like thoughts the mountain is thinking. Each step is worn smooth by centuries of footfalls, each curve calculated not just for practicality, but for something else. Perhaps reverence, perhaps the understanding that approach is itself a form of prayer. Clang the terraces appear first. Impossibly green against grey stone, these agricultural platforms cling to slopes that seem to deny the possibility of growth. Yet here, crops once flourished in soil that had to be carried up stone by stone, bag by bag. From valleys so far below they exist in a different climate entirely. The terraces step down the mountainside like a staircase built for giants, each level held by walls fitted with such precision that mortar was deemed unnecessary. The engineering speaks of patience, measured not in seasons but in generations. As we climb higher, gates emerge from mist. They are not defensive in the martial sense. No murder holes, no places for boiling oil. These gates frame the sky like windows into forever, their proportions designed not to keep anyone out, but to remind everyone entering where they were going. Up, always up, towards something the valley dwellers below could not reach, could not even properly see except as distant shapes wreathed in cloud. Pedestrians itself reveals itself gradually, as sacred things should. First, the outer buildings. Simple dwellings clinging to rock, their walls now open to weather, their roofs long since returned to the materials from which they were made. Then, as the path leads deeper, the architecture grows more complex, more intentional. Temples aligned with solstice sunrises, their doorways positioned with astronomical precision, so that twice a year, light falls in ways that transform stone into scripture. Water channels that defy gravity, carrying moisture from mountain springs through systems of aqueducts, and cascades that demonstrate a mastery of hydraulics that still impresses engineers who study them centuries later. The stones themselves are an enigma wrapped in labor. Some weigh tons. The nearest quarries capable of producing such blocks are days away, not hours, days. Across terrain that makes every step a negotiation with gravity and exhaustion. Yet somehow they came here. Theories exist. Rollers, ramps, thousands of workers coordinating through song and rhythm. But theories are not certainty. The method is lost. Only the result remains. Massive blocks fitted together with tolerances tighter than a blade's width, creating walls that have survived earthquakes that leveled everything in the valleys below. Fishing. It is said that those who lived here knew cold in their bones. Mountain nights are not gentle. At this altitude, when the sun drops below the peaks, temperature falls with brutal efficiency. We imagine them gathered around fires, wrapped in whatever woven warmth their looms could produce, their breath visible in air so thin that every inhalation is conscious, every exhalation a small gift of heat returned to the atmosphere. The taste of thin air becomes familiar as we linger. There is less oxygen here. Thought slows, body moves with deliberate care. Consciousness acquires a quality of dreamlike clarity, where small details become profound. Perhaps this was part of the intention. Perhaps living at this altitude induced a state of mind conducive to whatever spiritual or intellectual work these people deemed important enough to justify such hardship. Clouds move through the streets like visible spirits. This is not metaphor. At this elevation, weather happens at eye level. Mist rolls through plazas where ceremonies once took place, obscuring and revealing architecture in cycles that feel almost like breathing. One moment a temple stands clear against blue sky. The next it is veiled in white that reduces the world to suggestion and mystery. The people who lived here existed in conversation with this weather, built their days around its rhythms, perhaps saw in its movements messages or omens, or simply the physical manifestation of forces they revered. Why here? This question haunts every visitor, has haunted every scholar who studies this place. The valleys offered easier lives, warmer, more fertile, less demanding. Yet someone chose this mountaintop, many someones, enough to build not just an outpost but a city, complete with temples and plazas and residential districts and astronomical observatories. Was it defense? Possibly. An enemy approaching from below would arrive exhausted, altitude sick, visible long before they posed a threat. But defense alone does not explain the religious architecture, the careful astronomical alignments, the investment in beauty that goes beyond mere survival. Was it devotion? Perhaps. Mountains have always drawn the religious impulse, closer to sky, removed from the corruptions of lowland life, demanding sacrifice simply to exist. Maybe this city was itself an offering, a demonstration of faith rendered in stone and suffering, and the daily choice to remain despite every hardship. Was it astronomy? The arguments are compelling. From this height, the stars appear with a clarity impossible at lower elevations. The horizon is vast, unobstructed. Celestial events can be observed and measured with precision. Perhaps this was an observatory first and a city second, built by people for whom reading the heavens was the highest calling. Or was it escape? From enemies, from plague, from ways of life that had grown intolerable. History is full of people who chose hardship over remaining in circumstances they found unbearable. Perhaps this city began as refuge and became something else. Home, sacred site. The place where a culture refined itself in isolation until it became something unique. Something that could only have developed here, in air too thin for easy breath, in cold that tested resolve every night. The emotional journey through this place moves through awe into something quieter, more personal. There is wonder, yes, at the engineering and ambition. But beneath that is a recognition of human determination to transcend limitation, to reach toward the sky, even when the earth offered easier paths. These people chose difficulty, chose it and sustained it across generations. That choice speaks to something in the human spirit that refuses to settle, that insists on striving even when striving means suffering. We linger on specific details, because in details the past becomes present. Here, a fountain still flowing after centuries, its source a spring that has never failed, its basin carved from a single block of stone, its overflow channeling away through grooves worn smooth by water's patient passage. The sound of falling water in this high silence is almost shocking, a voice of continuity connecting this moment to all the moments when others stood here, listening to this same sound. There, a window perfectly positioned to capture the winter sun's first rays. On the shortest day of the year, light pours through this opening and falls precisely on an altar stone, illuminating carvings that remain in shadow every other day of the year. This is not accident. This is intention across centuries. The builders knew where the sun would be, not just in their lifetime, but in all lifetimes to follow. And here, a courtyard where silence feels thick enough to touch. The walls rise on all sides, blocking wind, creating a space of such profound quiet that your own heartbeat becomes audible. Perhaps this was a meditation space, a place for whatever spiritual practices these people developed in their isolation. Or perhaps it was simply a courtyard, and its silence is accidental, a byproduct of proportion and position that coincidentally creates this pocket of such complete stillness that it feels sacred whether or not it was intended to be. The descent begins, as all descents must, with a last look backward. The city does not call out. It does not insist. It simply is, has been, will continue to be for as long as stone can persist against weather and time. As we move downward, following the same ancient path in reverse, the ruins disappear into mist behind us. From below, the city becomes invisible again, just shapes in cloud, hints of structure where structure should not be, the suggestion of walls where only sky should exist. It becomes once again what it has always been to those who do not make the climb. A question mark written in stone against the face of eternity. Perhaps that is its truest purpose. Not defense or devotion or astronomy or escape, but question. A permanent interrogation of what is possible, what is necessary, what humans will endure in pursuit of something they deem worth the cost. The city asks, what are you willing to climb toward? What will you build if unbound by practicality? How high will you go before you decide the air is too thin, the cold too bitter, the distance from comfort too great? The city offers no answers. Cities never do. They only demonstrate that someone, once, chose differently than we might have chosen, valued things we might not value, saw potential where we see only hardship. And as the last of the ruins fade into mist above and behind, as the path leads us back toward air that fills lungs without effort, toward warmth that comes without fire, we carry with us the weight of that demonstration. The knowledge that humans built there, lived there, perhaps loved there, in a place that the earth did not intend for human habitation, and made of it something beautiful enough to outlast the names of its builders and the language they spoke, and the reasons they gave for choosing such impossible heights. The whispers fade, the wind continues, and somewhere above, wrapped in cloud, the city waits. Patient, silent, eternal as questions are eternal, offering itself not as answer, but as evidence that once, long ago, someone asked something we are still trying to understand. Some knowledge was never meant to be written, not because it was forbidden, but because writing would have killed it, frozen something living into something fixed, trapped breath into symbols, reduced the sacred intimacy of voice into the cold distance of text. Greenwich began in firelight, not one fire, but countless fires across countless nights, in places separated by oceans and centuries, but united by a single understanding, that the most important truths must be kept alive in human memory, must be spoken from mouth to ear, must live in the body and the breath, and the careful repetition that connects one generation to the next, like a chain of flesh reaching backward into time. Picture a child sitting at the feet of an elder as darkness gathers. The fire throws shadows that dance on faces, on hands that gesture as they speak, on eyes that watch to ensure the child is not just hearing, but absorbing, not just listening, but becoming a vessel for something larger than themselves. This is not education as we understand it. This is transmission. This is the passing of worlds from one mind to another, unmediated by page or symbol, pure as song, fragile as breath. Receiver educated, and in speaking, holds an entire civilization. Not on shelves or in archives, but in memory, in the vast, trained, disciplined architecture of human recall that we have largely forgotten how to build. The child listens, and in listening, begins to carry forward everything that matters. Who the people are, where they came from, what they owe to the ancestors, how to speak to the divine, where the sacred places wait, what the stars mean, how the seasons turn, what constitutes justice, beauty, truth. There were cultures that could have developed writing but chose not to. Deliberately, consciously. They looked at the symbols their neighbors pressed into clay or carved into stone and decided, no, this is not how we will preserve ourselves. We will not trust our truth to marks that anyone can read, that can be stolen or burned or misinterpreted by those who do not understand. We will keep our knowledge alive, which means we will keep it in the living. Physically, the griots of West Africa were human libraries. For centuries, longer than many nations have existed, they maintained genealogies that stretched back through generations beyond counting. They could recite the names of kings and the deeds that defined them, could trace lineages through marriages and battles and migrations, could tell you who your ancestors were 15 generations back and what they accomplished and what obligations their choices placed upon you. This was not performance, though it was often beautiful. This was the social contract made audible, the structure of society encoded in narrative and preserved through perfect recall. When a griot spoke your family's history, you were not hearing a story. You were hearing proof of your place in the world, confirmation of your identity, the evidence of your belonging rendered in voice and rhythm. The griot's memory was the archive. Their death was the burning of the library. Whispers tell us of the Aboriginal songlines that mapped an entire continent through melody. Every hill, every waterhole, every sacred site was encoded in song. Not described but embodied, so that singing the landscape was equivalent to walking it, so that navigation became a kind of prayer. The songs held not just geography but lore, not just direction but meaning. They told you where to go and also why it mattered, what ancestors walked this path, what ceremonies must be performed at each location. This was not writing, but it was text, a text written in melody, carried in voice, transmitted through teaching that was inseparable from relationship. You learned the songs from someone who loved you enough to teach you, who judged you worthy enough to carry this forward. The songs lived in bodies, required breath, demanded presence. They could not be stolen by invaders who did not speak the language. They could only be broken by silence, by the severing of the teaching relationship, by the interruption of transmission. The Druids of ancient Europe spent 20 years in training, memorizing vast bodies of knowledge that they refused on principle to write down. Caesar remarked on this with puzzlement. Why would they not use writing when they clearly knew of it? The answer, according to what little survived their suppression, was that written knowledge becomes dead knowledge. It can be copied by anyone. It loses the context of proper understanding. It forgets the tone of voice, the expression on the teacher's face, the quality of silence that should follow certain revelations. The Druids believed that truth was too alive to be trapped, that wisdom required not just information but formation, the slow transformation of the student through sustained contact with the teacher, through years of memorization that rewired the mind into a proper vessel for what was being poured into it. It is said that a single Druid could hold in memory what would fill a dozen books. Legal judgments, astronomical calculations, genealogies, myths, rituals, herb lore, philosophy, poetry. All of it encoded in mind, recalled perfectly when needed, taught selectively to those deemed ready to receive it. These were not mere storytellers. They were guardians, human vessels for everything their cultures considered essential, walking archives, living repositories of identity and meaning and the accumulated wisdom of centuries. Powerless texture of this is reverence, must be reverence, because we are speaking of something that demands to be honored even in its absence. These were human beings who chose to become more than themselves, who trained their minds into instruments of preservation, who accepted the burden of being the memory for their people, who understood that if they failed, if the chain broke, something irreplaceable would be lost. And the chain did break. Again and again, across centuries and continents, it broke. Conquest broke it. When empires expanded, they brought writing and often insisted on it, deemed oral tradition primitive, systematically dismantled the institutions that sustained memory keepers. The last Druids died under Roman persecution, taking with them knowledge that can never be recovered. The last keeper of certain Aboriginal songlines died without teaching them, and with them died not just songs but maps, not just maps but relationships with land that stretched back 50,000 years. Conversion broke it. Missionaries arrived with writing and new gods and the conviction that oral tradition was pagan, inferior, in need of replacement. They sometimes recorded fragments, enough to torture later scholars with glimpses of what was lost. But the full depth, The living context, the sacred intimacy, died in the translation from spoken to written, from initiated keeper to curious outsider with paper and pen. Plague broke it. When disease swept through populations, it killed indiscriminately, old and young, keeper and listener. Sometimes the elder died before finishing the teaching. Sometimes the student died before achieving mastery. And in those deaths, knowledge died too, completely, as if it had never existed. And sometimes, most tragically, time itself broke the chain. The young generation stopped wanting to learn. Modernity offered different enticements. The old way seemed burdensome, the memorization pointless when books could hold information more reliably. The elder would grow old with their knowledge, looking for a successor who never came, dying at last with entire worlds locked in their skull, taking those worlds into silence as complete as if they had never been spoken. The tragedy, when it came, was absolute. When the last keeper died without passing on their knowledge, entire cosmologies vanished in a single breath. The gods' names were forgotten. The creation stories dissolved. The legal precedents that had maintained justice for centuries became inaccessible. The songs that held the land together returned to silence. The genealogies that proved who belonged and why were severed, leaving people unmoored from their own history, where ruins remain, where fragments might be recovered, where the possibility of reconstruction exists. This was erasure. This was the transformation of knowledge into nothing, voice into silence, meaning into void. Yet there is something else worth considering, something that perhaps softens the grief without diminishing it. Oral tradition, for all its fragility, possessed an intimacy that writing can never achieve. The knowledge lived in relationship. You learned from someone who knew you, who had chosen you, who transmitted not just information but themselves, their voice, their presence, their caring enough to ensure you understood. The knowledge lived in the body. To remember thousands of lines of poetry or genealogy or law required physical training of the mind. The act of memorization changed you. You became, in some sense, the thing you were remembering. The knowledge was not separate from you, filed away like a book on a shelf. It was you. It moved when you moved. It breathed when you breathed. Imagine being one of these guardians. Imagine carrying in your mind the names of 100 ancestors, each name connected to stories, to places, to obligations that those ancestors' choices created. Imagine knowing the locations of sacred sites not as coordinates on a map, but as felt relationships, as places you have visited in mind so many times through memorization that you could walk to them in darkness. Imagine holding in your voice the proper words to address the divine, not prayers read from a page, but invocations that live in your throat, that carry the weight of centuries of repetition, that connect your breath to the breath of every keeper who came before you. This was burden, yes, but it was also honor. It was meaning. It was the profound responsibility of being the vessel through which your people's truth flowed from past to future. The chapter must close in silence, because silence is what remains. The voices that once held worlds together are gone. The griots who could recite for 3 days without repetition are dust. The druids, with their 20 years of training, are vanished. The Aboriginal elders who held songlines in their bodies are, in too many cases, the last of their kind. Fleeing, and this is offered gently as one offers comfort. Perhaps something persists. Not the knowledge itself, which is irretrievable, but the fact of it. The fact that it existed. The fact that human beings chose to live this way, to be this way, to carry entire civilizations in their minds and pass them forward in their voices. That fact remains even when the content is lost. And it reminds us that there are ways of knowing the world that we have forgotten, ways of preserving truth that we abandoned in favor of writing's permanence, ways of being human that involved becoming a living bridge between past and future. Of guardians are gone. Their secrets died with them. But the echo persists. Faint, yes, but real. In languages that still carry traces of oral traditions, in cultures that remember what it meant to have memory keepers, in the recognition that some of the most precious knowledge ever held by humans existed not in libraries, but in the trained minds of those who love their people enough to become, themselves, the library. And as sleep approaches, perhaps we honor them best by falling silent ourselves, by recognizing that some things cannot be fully spoken, only felt. The weight of what was lost, the beauty of what existed, the profound and permanent silence where voices once carried everything that mattered, singing the world into being with nothing more than breath and memory and the sacred determination to keep the past alive in the present. For the sake of a future they would never see but trusted was worth the burden of remembering. Beneath the waves, where sunlight fractures into green uncertainty, where currents move like slow breathing across the floor of the Mediterranean, something waited. Not patiently, objects do not feel patience, but persistently, corroded by centuries of salt and time, its purpose forgotten, its genius dissolved into the general anonymity of debris scattered across the seafloor where ships have come to rest since humans first trusted themselves to wood and canvas. Jang, it was fishermen who found it. Their nets, dragged across the bottom in search of simpler prizes, caught on something heavier than expected. When they hauled up their burden, tangled among the usual detritus of the deep, there gleamed, even through encrustation and corrosion, the promise of complexity. Not treasure in the traditional sense, something stranger. Something that would, when finally understood, prove more valuable than gold. Evidence of a sophistication the ancient world was not supposed to possess. This is the story of the Antikythera mechanism. But it is also the story of all the machines and methods and knowledge that existed once and then vanished, leaving only fragments or whispers or, more often, nothing at all. Just a gap in the historical record where something remarkable should be but isn't, where continuity broke and progress forgot what it had already learned. The object, when cleaned and examined, revealed itself slowly. At first, it seemed merely damaged, a mass of corroded bronze, barely recognizable as anything human-made. But patient scholars, working with emerging technologies like X-ray imaging, began to perceive what lay hidden beneath the centuries. Gears. Not crude gears, but precisely cut mechanisms fitted together with an understanding of ratios and rotation that spoke of deep mathematical knowledge. More than 30 interlocking gears, some with as many as 200 teeth, arranged in a configuration that took decades to fully comprehend. It is said that when researchers finally understood what they were looking at, the reaction was not celebration, but disbelief. This could not be. The timeline was wrong. The technology was impossible. This level of mechanical sophistication should not exist until more than 1,000 years after the date of the shipwreck that preserved it. But there it was, undeniable. A calculator of celestial movements, a predictor of eclipses, a mechanical poem about the heavens rendered in bronze gears and careful engineering. Turn the handle, if you could. If the corrosion hadn't frozen everything into permanence, and the machine would show you where the planets would be, when the moon would darken, how the cycles of the cosmos unfolded in their intricate dance. It was an analog computer, built around 100 BCE that encoded astronomical knowledge into physical form. Slowly, like silt after disturbance. 2,000 years ago, minds conceived of automation. Not in theory, not in philosophical speculation, but in actual bronze and careful calculation. They understood that cosmic patterns could be captured in mechanical relationships, that if you designed the gears correctly, the machine could think, could process inputs and return answers, could translate the rotation of a handle into the prediction of eclipses, could embody knowledge so completely that operating it required no understanding, only turning. Who made this? We imagine the craftsman in his workshop, lamplight falling on bronze discs marked with divisions so fine they required magnification to create accurately. We imagine hands that understood metal, that knew how much pressure would cut a gear tooth cleanly, that had made so many such mechanisms that this level of precision had become almost routine. Because this mechanism, the one that survived because it happened to sink in the right place at the right time, this cannot have been unique. You don't create something this sophisticated on the first attempt. This represents a tradition, a lineage of mechanical knowledge, a long conversation between craftsmen and astronomers about how to trap the heavens in bronze. We imagine too the astronomer who commissioned it or consulted on its design. Someone who knew the cycles well enough to specify the gear ratios that would replicate them. Someone who had spent years tracking the moon's complicated motion, the sun's annual path, the wandering of planets through the fixed stars. Someone who understood that knowledge could be preserved not just in texts but in machines. That the cosmos could be taught to teach itself through the proper arrangement of bronze circles. And the sailors who carried it across wine-dark seas, did they know what they transported? Or was it simply cargo, another rich man's possession, valuable for its metal if nothing else? The ship that carried it sank, for reasons we can only guess. Storm, perhaps, navigation error, structural failure. And with it went not just this mechanism, but everything else aboard. People, certainly, whose names are lost, whose stories ended in cold water and pressure and the slow work of the sea. What else went down with them? What other devices, what other knowledge, what other evidence of ancient sophistication now rests on the Mediterranean floor, too corroded to recognize, too fragmented to understand, or simply gone? Dissolved by time and salt into component atoms that tell no tales? This is the uncomfortable question the Antikythera mechanism poses. What else existed that left no trace? Machines of wood that rotted, devices melted down for their metal, knowledge that died with the scholars who held it. History is written by what survives, but survival is often accidental, dependent on factors that have nothing to do with importance or brilliance. We know the Romans made concrete that has outlasted modern formulations. The recipe was lost during the Dark Ages and only recently rediscovered. We know ancient surgeons performed cataract operations, trepanation, even caesarean sections with survival rates that seem impossible for their era. The techniques were described in texts that survived, but the full knowledge, the subtle skills that made them work, died with the practitioners. There are references in ancient texts to other marvels. The Baghdad batteries that may or may not have been used for electroplating, the flexible glass that allegedly could be hammered without shattering, the Greek fire whose formula was kept so secret that it was eventually forgotten. The astronomical instruments mentioned in passing, but never described in sufficient detail to reconstruct. Each reference is a glimpse of something larger, a hint that the ancient world possessed capabilities we've forgotten or underestimated. The emotional texture of this realization is bittersweet. There is pride. Look what humans achieved with nothing but bronze and mathematical insight, and the determination to understand the cosmos. But there is also sorrow, because the achievement was forgotten. The knowledge broke. The tradition ended, and for more than 1,000 years no one in Europe made anything approaching the mechanical sophistication of the Antikythera mechanism. This is the truth about progress that we resist acknowledging. It is not a straight line ascending toward greater sophistication. It is a path that sometimes circles, that backtracks, that forgets and must relearn. Civilizations rise and accumulate knowledge and then fall, taking their knowledge with them. The accumulation is not guaranteed. The continuity is fragile. Beneath the silence of these realizations is a deeper question. How much have we lost without knowing we lost it? If the Antikythera mechanism had dissolved completely, if the bronze had corroded beyond recognition, if the ship had landed in deeper water where no fisherman would find it, we would never know it existed. We would assume, as scholars assumed before its discovery, that such devices were impossible for the ancient world. We would be wrong, but confidently wrong, our ignorance complete and invisible. What other ignorances do we carry? What other capabilities did the ancient world possess that left no trace? What knowledge do we believe never existed because the evidence happened not to survive? The chapter must return to where it began, underwater. In the green silence where light arrives weak and scattered, where visibility extends only a few meters, where the floor is littered with the broken cargo of millennia of shipping. Amphoras rest in rows where they fell when their carrying vessel broke apart. Statues lie half buried in sediment, coins scatter like scales. And among all this debris, there may rest other devices, other mechanisms, other evidence of sophistication that we will never find because the sea has claimed them too completely, or because we wouldn't recognize them even if we hauled them up, or because they've already been discovered and discarded as shapeless lumps of corrosion, their genius indistinguishable from refuse. The Antikythera mechanism survived by accident, the right depth, the right sediment, the right fisherman at the right time. How many accidents didn't happen? How many mechanisms rusted away in shallower waters, or were found and melted down before anyone understood their significance, or remain hidden still, waiting for nets that may never come? Perhaps this is the mechanism's deepest lesson, that history is not what happened, but what survived happening. That knowledge is more fragile than we imagine. That human ingenuity has always exceeded what the fragments allow us to prove. That the past was not primitive but parallel. People as intelligent as us, as creative, as capable, working with different materials and constraints, but achieving sophistications that put our assumptions to shame. And so we leave the mechanism in its museum case, still corroded, still incomplete, still holding secrets that X-rays and CT scans have only partially revealed. We leave it as evidence and warning both. Evidence of what humans can achieve, warning of how easily achievement can be lost. Shimmer where in the green silence other secrets rest, waiting perhaps, or dissolve beyond recovery. The tide does not distinguish between important and trivial, between genius and refuse. It takes everything equally, preserves some, erases others, offers no accounting of what might have been. And as sleep approaches, perhaps we carry with us this understanding, that we stand not at the pinnacle of a climb, but at one point on a long circular path. That others walked here before and saw things we cannot see, knew things we have forgotten. built things we're only now learning were possible. That history is not accumulation, but conversation. With the past, with possibility, with the uncomfortable recognition that we too will be forgotten, our sophistications dissolved, our certainties corroded, until perhaps some future fisher hauls us up by accident and marvels that we knew what we knew, that we built what we built, that we were capable of more than the ruins alone would suggest. The machine found beneath the tide speaks across centuries, not in words, not in clear language, but in gears and ratios and the stubborn persistence of bronze in seawater. It says, "We were here. We understood. We made this. Remember us if you can. Remember what we knew. Remember that knowledge is always temporary, always one shipwreck away from silence, always dependent on the accidents of preservation and discovery to connect then to now. The tide continues its work, patient and indifferent. And in the green silence, other machines may rest, their genius reduced to unrecognizable lumps, their message never delivered, their lessons lost before they could be learned. The night sky was once a different country. Not metaphorically, literally different. The stars our ancestors studied, the patterns they traced with their eyes and encoded in stone and myth, are not precisely the stars we see when we manage to escape the electric glow that has claimed our nights. The sky itself is subject to forgetting. We begin in darkness, real darkness, the kind that existed before cities learned to push back the night with artificial suns. Lie on your back, if you can imagine it, on earth that still holds the day's warmth, and look up. Not glancing, not casual observation, but the kind of sustained attention our ancestors gave the heavens, hours of watching, night after night, season after season, generation after generation, until the movements above became as familiar as the movements of their own hands. Try to see what they saw. Not distant balls of fusing hydrogen, not the cold astronomical facts we've learned, but gods, ancestors, maps written in light, calendars that told you when to plant and when to harvest, when to prepare for flood and when to expect drought. Stories that held your people's history, their values, their understanding of how the cosmos worked and where humans fit within it. Flooring this is harder than it sounds. We have trained ourselves not to see this way. We know too much and, paradoxically, understand too little. We know the stars are distant suns, but we've forgotten how to read them as our ancestors did, as intimate participants in earthly life, as partners in the eternal dance between above and below, as teachers whose lessons were written in slow motion across the vault of night. The Egyptians aligned their pyramids with Orion's belt, not approximately, precisely. The 3 great pyramids at Giza mirror those 3 stars with an accuracy that speaks of sustained observation and profound astronomical knowledge. But this was not merely engineering. Orion was Osiris, god of death and resurrection. The pyramids were not just tombs, but stargates, carefully oriented portals meant to facilitate the pharaoh's journey to the heavens. The architecture was theology rendered in stone, an argument about the cosmos and humanity's place within it. The Maya calculated Venus's cycles with extraordinary precision, more accurate, in some respects, than European astronomers would achieve until the age of telescopes. They tracked this wandering star through the heavens, noting when it appeared as morning star and when as evening star, when it disappeared behind the sun and when it emerged again. They recorded these observations in codices, encoded them in temple architecture, built their calendar systems around the intricate harmonies between Venus, the sun, and the moon. Why such attention? Because Venus was not just a planet, it was a god, beautiful and dangerous, associated with war and sacrifice, with cycles of death and rebirth. To know when Venus would rise was to know when the gods favored certain actions, when kings should go to war, when ceremonies must be performed. The astronomy was inseparable from the astrology, the science from the sacred, the observation from the meaning. Quadratic, it is said that Polynesian navigators could find tiny islands across thousands of miles of open ocean using only the stars. The patterns of waves, the flight of birds, and a kind of spatial memory so refined it seems almost magical to modern minds trained to depend on instruments. They memorize star paths, the rising and setting points of particular stars throughout the year, and use them as highways across the trackless sea. This knowledge was not written but sung, encoded in chants that could be passed from navigator to student across generations. Imagine possessing such knowledge. Imagine being able to look at the night sky and see not mystery but map, not randomness but route. Imagine trusting your life and your passengers' lives to this memorized stellar geography, sailing for days or weeks without sight of land, steering by stars whose positions you held in your mind with such certainty that doubt never entered. This was not faith, this was knowledge. But knowledge of a kind we've largely abandoned, intimate, embodied, inseparable from the person who held it, requiring not just memorization, but a transformation of consciousness, a way of being in the world that made you part of the cosmos rather than separate from it. The sacred observatories still stand, those that haven't crumbled. Stonehenge, that circle of massive stones on Salisbury Plain, aligned with solstice sunrise and sunset. Chichen Itza, where the pyramid's design creates the illusion of a serpent descending the stairs during equinoxes. Goseck Circle in Germany, one of the oldest solar observatories in the world, where Neolithic peoples mark the sun's movements with wooden posts and earthen banks. These were not primitive attempts at science. They were sophisticated instruments, built by cultures that understood the heavens with a depth that modern astronomy, for all its technological advancement, has not replicated. We know more facts, distances, compositions, the physics of stellar fusion. But they knew the sky in a way we don't, as something alive and meaningful, as something that spoke directly to human concerns. The emotional journey through this realization is one of disconnection and yearning. We have severed ourselves from a relationship that once defined human consciousness. Light pollution has stolen the stars from most of humanity. In cities, where most of us now live, the night sky is a pale ghost of what it once was. The Milky Way, that river of light our ancestors knew intimately, is invisible. Most of the stars are gone, washed out by streetlights and advertisements and the endless glow of human habitation. Can see the stars, we don't know how to read them. We've forgotten the stories. We don't know which star rises when, which constellation marks the seasons, how to navigate by the heavens. We've delegated that knowledge to instruments, satellites and GPS and algorithms, and in doing so, we've lost something that cannot be measured in data, but was nonetheless profound. Whispers tell us what it meant to live by the moon's phases, though we can barely imagine it now. The moon determined when you planted, when you harvested, when you hunted, when you held ceremonies. Its light was the only illumination available for night work, so its waxing and waning structured activity with an authority no clock could match. Women's bodies synchronized with its cycles in ways that seemed to prove the connection between human and celestial was not metaphorical but literal, biological, real. To plant by starrise, to know that when certain stars appeared on the eastern horizon at dusk, it was time to prepare fields, to gather harvest, to prepare for winter. This was to understand the year not as an abstract number, but as a returning pattern written in light across the vault of night. Time was not something imposed from outside, measured by machines. Time was something you read in the sky, something that connected you to cycles so vast they predated humanity and would continue long after. Yet cycles that human life could align with and draw meaning from. The chapter must consider what was lost when this knowledge faded. Not just astronomical data. We have more of that now than ever before. What was lost was entire frameworks of meaning. When the stars stopped being gods and ancestors and became merely distant suns. When the sky stopped being a text to be read and became simply space, something in human consciousness changed. We gained objective knowledge but lost participatory knowing. We understood more but felt less connected. Some believe the disconnection runs deeper still. That when we lost our relationship with the night sky, we lost a certain kind of humility, a recognition that we are small within something vast, that our lives unfold within cycles we don't control, that above us, literally, visibly, every clear night, is evidence of our place within a cosmos that predates us and will outlast us. The dark sky was a nightly reminder of mystery, of the limits of human knowing, of forces and scales that dwarf human concerns. We traded that for certainty, for electric light that lets us pretend night doesn't exist, for cities that glow so bright we forget we live on a planet that spins through darkness, for lives so insulated from natural cycles that we can pretend we're not subject to them. But the loss goes further still. The constellations themselves have changed. Precession, the slow wobble of Earth's axis, means that over millennia, the position of stars relative to the seasons shifts. The pole star changes. The constellation that marked spring equinox 3,000 years ago is not the one that marks it now. And stellar motion, the actual movement of stars through space, means that the patterns themselves deform over vast timescales. The Big Dipper looked different to the earliest humans than it does to us. Given enough time, it will look different still to our descendants. Even the heavens are subject to forgetting. The sky our ancestors knew is not precisely the sky we see. The patterns they traced, the meanings they found, existed in a specific moment of cosmic configuration that will never exactly repeat. Their sky is gone, as surely as their languages and cities and names are gone. Dawn comes, as dawn always does. The stars fade into blue, first the dimmer ones, then the bright ones, until finally even Venus, the morning star, the last light of night, surrenders to the sun. And in that fading, perhaps there is a metaphor for what we've lost. Not that the stars are gone, but that we can no longer see them. Not that the knowledge has been destroyed, but that we've flooded our lives with light that makes the ancient darkness and the wisdom it contained inaccessible. We look up now with different eyes. We see hydrogen and helium, fusion and gravity, red giants and white dwarfs. We see a universe governed by physical laws, beautiful in its mechanics but empty of meaning beyond what we import into it. We seek different answers than our ancestors sought, ask different questions, value different kinds of knowledge. And perhaps that's neither entirely good nor entirely bad. Perhaps it's simply different. But it's worth acknowledging what was forgotten in the exchange. What it meant to live in intimate conversation with the night sky. What it felt like to know the stars as teachers and guides and ancestors and gods. What it was to navigate by starlight, to plant by starrise, to structure your understanding of time and meaning and your place in the cosmos according to patterns traced in the darkness above. The constellations they saw, both literally and metaphorically, are lost to us now. Not completely, perhaps. Fragments remain. Stonehenge still stands. The pyramids still point to Orion. Somewhere, a few navigators still know the star paths. But the living relationship, the cultural knowledge that made the night sky home rather than foreign space, has faded like stars at dawn. We can sleep approaches. Perhaps we have gained so much knowledge, yet lost a way of knowing. That we have conquered darkness, yet surrendered what darkness taught. That we look up now and see less than our ancestors saw, not because our vision is worse, but because we've forgotten how to look, what to look for, why it matters. The stars remain, patient, distant, unchanged in their essence even as their positions slowly drift. They keep their ancient watch over a species that has largely stopped watching back, that has chosen electric light over starlight, GPS over celestial navigation, abstract time over cosmic rhythm. Perhaps someday we will remember. Perhaps someday the darkness will return, by choice or catastrophe, and we will look up with ancient eyes, seeing not distant suns, but questions written in light. Seeing not empty space, but a vast conversation we've temporarily stopped listening to. Seeing not astronomy, but meaning, connection, home. Until then, the constellation they saw that we have lost remains lost. Not in space, but in us. Not destroyed, but forgotten. Waiting, perhaps, for the night when we remember to look up, not with instruments, but with wonder. Not seeking data, but seeking what our ancestors found there every night. Evidence that we belong to something larger, something cyclical, something that returns again and again, marking time, telling stories, reminding us, if we would only listen, that we are small and temporary, but part of something vast and eternal. Written in light across the darkness, speaking in a language we once knew by heart, and might, if we tried, remember. Abandonment is its own kind of ghost. Not the dramatic spectre of legend, but something quieter, more pervasive, the absence that fills spaces where presence once defined everything. Empty doorways, silent courtyards, altars that will receive no more offerings. The profound stillness of places where human voices once filled every corner and now fill none. We begin with a question that haunts archaeologists and troubles sleep. Why would a thriving culture walk away from everything they built? Not flee in panic, not evacuate under immediate threat, but simply leave. Abandoned cities that took generations to construct, temples aligned with sacred geometry, homes where families had lived for centuries. Walk away and never return, leaving behind only silence and the slow encroachment of nature reclaiming what was briefly borrowed. The examples accumulate like evidence of some universal fragility we prefer not to acknowledge. Angkor Wat, that vast temple complex in Cambodia, gradually surrendered to jungle. Not conquered, not destroyed, emptied. The people who maintained it, who swept its courtyards and tended its shrines and performed ceremonies in its shadowed galleries, simply ceased to be there. The jungle, which had been waiting at the edges with patient vegetable hunger, began its work. Roots split stone, vines covered carvings, trees grew through roofs, And within a few generations, one of humanity's greatest architectural achievements had become a rumor, a legend, a place whispered about but rarely visited, guarded by forest and forgetting. The Anasazi cliff dwellings of the American Southwest tell a similar story compressed into even shorter time frame. These elaborate stone structures built into canyon walls, sophisticated, well-designed, positioned for defense and oriented for astronomical observation, were inhabited for centuries. And then, in what appears to be a single generation, they emptied. The people climbed down from their cliff homes and walked away. Where they went remains debated. Why they left is still mysterious. Pancake's Great Zimbabwe's stone walls stand over a city that simply ceased. Those massive granite constructions, fitted without mortar, enclosing courtyards that once bustled with trade and governance and daily life. Now they frame only grass and wind and the occasional bird. The people who built them, who maintained a civilization sophisticated enough to trade with distant coast, who developed mining and metallurgy and political systems complex enough to coordinate large populations, vanished from this place so completely that even their descendants lost clear memory of them. It is said that drought drove them away, that climate change, not the modern kind but the ancient cyclical kind that has always punctuated human history, made their lands untenable. The rains failed, crops withered, water sources dried, and eventually, faced with the choice between staying and starving or leaving and surviving, they chose survival. They walked away from everything, carrying what they could, abandoning the rest to silence. What believe it was disease? That plague swept through with such devastating and depleted, could not maintain the complex social structures that city life requires. Or perhaps the disease was not just biological but spiritual. A loss of faith in the systems and beliefs that had once made this particular arrangement of stone and social order feel meaningful, necessary, worth sustaining. Perhaps it was invasion. Not the kind that destroys, but the kind that displaces, that makes remaining impossible or undesirable. Enemies at the borders, trade routes cut, the slow strangulation of siege without the drama of battle. Or perhaps internal collapse, the social contract breaking under the weight of inequality or corruption, or simply the accumulated resentments that can make a place feel unbearable even when it's physically intact. Peacefully, and this is harder for modern minds to grasp, the reasons were spiritual. Sacred in ways we can barely conceive. That prophecy demanded departure, that the gods spoke through oracle or omen and said, "Leave this place." That the land itself, through mechanisms our secularized consciousness struggles to credit, communicated that the relationship between people and place had ended, that it was time to move on. That staying would violate something fundamental about how the cosmos was structured. The emotional texture of contemplating these abandonments is one of unease and empathy. Unease because they remind us that civilization is more fragile than we pretend, that the complex can unravel quickly, that what seems permanent might be temporary. Empathy because behind every abandoned city are individual stories of departure. The decision to leave, the last look backward, the grief of severing connection with place. Flush, imagine the final days. Not all at once, probably. More likely a gradual exodus. The young leave first, seeking opportunity elsewhere. Then families, then the merchants who need customers. Until finally, only the elderly remain, the deeply rooted, those for whom leaving would be a death sentence anyway. And eventually even they are gone, died in place, or carried away by relatives, or simply vanished into the general fog where all ending stories go. We move through these empty places slowly now, centuries or millennia later, and notice what was left behind. Tools mid-repair, as if the craftsman set down the hammer intending to return tomorrow and never did. Grain stores depleted but not empty. They took what they could carry, but much remained, eventually to rot, or be consumed by rodents, or simply dissolve into the soil from which it came. Doorways that still frame nothing, that still mark the threshold between inside and outside, even though the distinction has become meaningless. The archaeology of absence is its own discipline. How do you reconstruct a culture from what they chose not to take, from the silence they left behind? The things that remain are the things that weren't worth carrying, too heavy, too fragile, too tied to this specific place to transplant. Or they're the things that couldn't be moved, the architecture, the art carved into stone, the irrigation systems, the roads. Whispers tell us that somewhere in these ruins, if we look carefully, we can find evidence of the final moments. A door barred from the outside, a fireplace that was deliberately extinguished, a shrine where offerings were placed and then never collected, as if someone performed one last ritual before walking away, leaving the gods to decide what to do with gifts that would never be received. We imagine individual stories within the collective departure, because this is how we make sense of the incomprehensible, by reducing it to human scale, by finding the child within the chronicle. The child who left behind a favorite toy, not because they didn't love it, but because the adults said they could only carry so much, and survival required different priorities. That toy still rests somewhere in the ruins, clay or wood or carved stone, no longer identifiable as toy perhaps, but once held by small hands that brought it everywhere, that whispered to it, that made it part of the landscape of childhood that was about to end. The elder too weak to travel, who chose or was chosen to stay behind. What were their final days like, alone in a city emptying around them? Did they move through familiar streets grown strange with absence? Did they maintain their routines, rising at the accustomed hour, eating the same foods, performing the same small rituals until the end? Or did the solitude unmoor them, make them someone else, someone who could exist outside the social web that had previously defined them? The priest who performed one final ceremony before walking into history's fog, lighting the sacred fire one last time, speaking the prayers in an empty temple, closing the doors with the knowledge that they might never open again, carrying with them the secret knowledge, the oral traditions, the precise ways of doing things that made this particular version of civilization work. All of that walking away with them, to be adapted to new places, or diluted by integration with other peoples, or simply lost when the priest died without adequate successor. The narrative must explore what these abandonments reveal about fragility, about how quickly the complex can unravel when certain conditions are removed. Cities require constant maintenance, constant input of energy and resources and attention. Stop sweeping the streets and they fill with debris. Stop repairing the roofs and they leak, then collapse. Stop tending the irrigation systems and the water goes where it wants, which is rarely where you need it. Stop enforcing the social rules and order dissolves into something else. Not chaos necessarily, but a different arrangement that no longer supports city life. How thoroughly a way of life can end is the uncomfortable lesson. Not just a physical ending, buildings crumbling, walls falling, but the cultural ending. The knowledge of how to do things this specific way, the stories that explained why it mattered, The relationships and obligations and expectations that wove individuals into community, all of it can vanish so completely that even when we find the ruins, we cannot reconstruct the meaning. Beneath the silence of these places is the archaeological puzzle of trying to understand a culture from what they left behind. And what they left behind is, by definition, what they didn't value enough to take. The masterpieces, the sacred objects, the truly precious things, they carried those. We're excavating the discards, the too heavy, the too mundane, the structures that couldn't be moved. Trying to reconstruct a living culture from what was essentially its refuse is like trying to understand a person from their garbage. Possible perhaps, but limited. Flooring. Yet sometimes objects remain that shouldn't have been left. A jade mask in a temple cache, gold jewelry in a dwelling, things valuable enough that their abandonment suggests panic or sudden departure, or perhaps a different value system than we assume, one where these material goods mattered less than we think they should have. Blackmail must end as these places exist now, in silence. In the profound stillness of spaces where human activity once created constant sound. Voices, footsteps, the ring of hammer on bronze, children playing, merchants negotiating, priests chanting, lovers whispering. All of that now replaced by wind. Just wind moving through empty chambers, making sounds that might almost be voices if you listen with a mind inclined toward haunting. Sometimes the most complete ending is the one that offers no epilogue, no explanation. Just the fact of absence where presence used to be. The wind continues its work, carrying dust, eroding edges, slowly returning these human constructions to the earth from which their materials came. Birds nest in niches meant for other purposes. Small animals make homes in what were once gathering halls. Plants split stone with the patient pressure of roots that have no deadline. Abolish this is appropriate. Perhaps there is a rightness to the cycle, that what humans build eventually returns to nature, that dominance is temporary, that the earth absorbs our elaborate arrangements back into itself with neither malice nor celebration, just the inevitable process of time and weather, and the laws of thermodynamics gradually reducing complexity to simplicity. The silence where a people used to be is not empty. It's full of wind and birdsong and the small sounds of insects and vegetation, full of sunlight and shadow and the play of weather across surfaces that no longer mean what they meant, full of the absence itself, which is a kind of presence, a ghostly inverse of the life that was here. And as sleep approaches, perhaps we carry with us this understanding, that all the noise we make, all the elaboration of our lives, all the structures we build and maintain and invest with meaning, all of it is temporary. All of it will eventually return to silence. All of our cities, given sufficient time, will be the places where a people used to be. The question is not whether this will happen, but when, in what silence we will leave behind, and whether anyone will come after to wonder about us the way we wonder about them. The wind moves through empty chambers. The silence holds its secrets close. And somewhere in the ruins, a doorway still frames nothing, still marks a threshold between spaces that no one crosses anymore, still stands as evidence that once, long ago, there was something here, something complex and human and alive, before the silence came and made of it only memory, question, ghost. And maybe sometimes that fear is justified. Maybe some knowledge is dangerous. But who decides? And what corruptions attend the power to make such decisions? History suggests that those who burn books are rarely the heroes of the stories that survive. That censorship protects not truth but power. That ideas deemed too dangerous to allow are often simply too threatening to those who benefit from ignorance remaining widespread. We linger on the Library of Alexandria because it has become symbol as much as historical fact. The details of its destruction are murky, probably not one catastrophic fire, but gradual decline across centuries, combination of accidents and deliberate destruction, and simple neglect as funding dried up and priorities changed. But what's clear is the loss. Hundreds of thousands of scrolls, possibly more. The accumulated knowledge of the ancient Mediterranean world, gathered in one place, and then dispersed, burned or stolen or rotted or simply lost when the institution that housed them failed. What did we lose? We'll never know completely. That's the nature of erasure. It removes not just the thing, but the knowledge of the thing, leaves us unable even to catalogue what's missing. We have references, citations in surviving works that point to texts that no longer exist. Treatises on mathematics, lost plays, historical accounts of events we now know only through fragments, scientific observations that would take centuries to reduplicate. Pregnant. The emotional texture of contemplating these losses is bittersweet. We celebrate what survived, the texts that were buried and later found, the manuscripts copied often enough that some copies escaped the flames, the knowledge that persisted through oral tradition or that was recreated by later scholars who had to rediscover what was once known. But we mourn what didn't survive, the plays and poems and histories and scientific works that existed once and now are gone as completely as if they had never been written. And we recognize, uncomfortably, necessarily, that this story is not finished, that texts are still being suppressed, history still being rewritten, knowledge still being controlled by those who fear its free circulation. The methods have changed. Digital censorship is different from book burning, but the impulse is the same. To control what people can know, to limit the circulation of ideas deemed dangerous, to protect power by managing information. The chapter must close as it began, with burial, with the image of a jar being sealed, wrapped in protective cloth, lowered carefully into darkness. The person performing this act does not know when, or if, these texts will be found again, does not know if the safer age they hope for will arrive in their children's lifetime, or their descendants, or ever. They know only that this is the last option, that if these texts remain above ground, they will burn, that darkness and concealment offer better odds than light and confrontation. The jar descends into the cave, into the well, into the chamber excavated and then concealed. The earth receives it without ceremony, closes around it, keeps it as earth keeps so many secrets, patiently, silently, for decades or centuries or millennia or forever. Some of these hidden texts have been found. Some wait still, in caves not yet explored, or wells not yet drained, or beneath floors in buildings not yet excavated. Some have already dissolved beyond recovery, moisture or insects or time having accomplished what fire was prevented from doing. And some, perhaps, will never be found, will remain hidden until whatever catastrophe or geological process finally destroys them, until the earth that preserved them reclaims them completely. In the moment before the flames arrive, there is a choice. Not between fighting and fleeing. Those options have already been exhausted or deemed futile. The choice is smaller, more desperate, more pregnant with hope. To hide what cannot be defended. To trust the earth with what the fire will not spare. To bury knowledge in the faith that darkness is a better guardian than light. that concealment might accomplish what confrontation could not. This is how some texts survived. Not through the strength of institutions or the protection of armies, but through the trembling hands of those who wrapped scrolls in linen, sealed them in jars, and lowered them into caves or wells or secret chambers, hoping that someday, in a safer age, someone would find them and understand what they had been worth saving. We begin with discovery, because that is how these stories reach us, not with burial, but with resurrection. A Bedouin shepherd in 1947, throwing stones into a cave near the Dead Sea, hears not the expected sound of stone hitting stone, but the crack of pottery breaking. Inside the cave, jars. Inside the jars, scrolls wrapped in linen, brittle with age but intact, preserved by the desert's dry breath for 2,000 years. The Dead Sea Scrolls, texts hidden during the Jewish revolt against Rome, concealed from armies that would have destroyed them, containing versions of scriptures that differed from official canons, community rules, apocalyptic visions, interpretations that survived only because someone chose burial over loss. Or the Nag Hammadi Library, discovered in Egypt in 1945 by farmers digging for fertilizer. 13 leather-bound codices sealed in a jar, hidden sometime in the 4th century when Orthodox Christianity was consolidating power and alternative texts were being systematically destroyed. These were Gnostic Gospels, different stories about Jesus, different theological frameworks, perspectives deemed heretical and therefore dangerous. Someone, knowing that possession of these texts could mean death, chose to hide them rather than surrender them to flames. And the earth kept them safe for 1,600 years. Manuscripts walled up in desert caves, texts buried beneath false floors, libraries concealed behind masonry so skillfully that centuries passed before their discovery. These were not accidents. These were desperate acts of preservation performed by people who understood that what they were hiding would be hunted, that knowledge itself had become dangerous, that certain truths had been declared forbidden by those with the power to enforce their prohibitions with fire and sword. It is said that knowledge provokes fear when it threatens power. Alternative religious texts challenge the monopoly on truth that religious authorities claim. If there are other gospels, other interpretations, other ways of understanding the divine, then the official version loses its absolute authority. The crack in certainty, once visible, can widen into doubt, and doubt can erode the obedience that power structures require. Scientific observations that contradicted orthodoxy were similarly dangerous. Heliocentrism didn't just move the Earth from the center of the cosmos. It displaced humanity from its assumed position of cosmic importance, challenged the literal interpretation of scriptures, threatened the entire framework through which religious and political authority justified itself. When Galileo looked through his telescope and saw moons orbiting Jupiter, he saw evidence. When the Church looked at his observations, they saw danger. Historical accounts that challenged official narratives posed their own threat. Every regime writes its own history, and in that writing, erases or diminishes what doesn't serve its purposes. Alternative histories, accounts that credit different heroes, that blame different villains, that complicate the simple stories power tells about itself. These become intolerable. They must be suppressed, burned, forgotten, so that only one version remains and becomes, through monopoly, truth. Philosophical ideas deemed dangerous to social order have always provoked censorship. Ideas about equality when society was built on hierarchy. Ideas about individual conscience when obedience was required. Ideas about the nature of governance, when challenging authority was defined as treason. The powerful have always understood something that the powerless sometimes forget. Ideas are weapons. The right idea, spreading through the right population at the right moment, can topple thrones, can dissolve the bonds of obedience, can remake the world. And so the flames come, deliberately lit, carefully fed. Libraries burned not by accident but by policy, by the calculated decision that what is contained within them is too dangerous to allow to continue existing. Imagine the hands that wrapped these scrolls before burial. Were they steady or shaking? Did the person performing this final act of preservation believe they would live to see these texts retrieved? Or did they know this was a gift to an unknown future, a message in a bottle thrown not across water, but across time? The linen would have been clean, the best available. The jar would have been sealed with care, with pitch or wax or both, anything to keep out moisture, insects, decay. And then the burial, in caves that only locals knew, in wells that had run dry, in chambers excavated specifically for this purpose, concealed behind walls that would stand for centuries. Playground, the emotional texture of this moment must have been complex. Grief, certainly. For the community that could no longer safely possess these texts, for the teachers who could no longer teach from them, for the students who would grow up not knowing what was being hidden. But also hope, the stubborn, irrational hope that things would change, that someday it would be safe again, that these texts would speak once more to people who could openly read them. And anger, the fury of being forced to hide truth, of living in a world where knowledge itself has become contraband, where thinking the wrong thoughts or reading the wrong text can cost you your life. The texts buried in these caches were not pornography or poison. They were theology, history, philosophy, scripture. And they had to be hidden like crimes, preserved like secrets, because someone with power had decided they were too dangerous to exist. Whispers tell us what we might still be missing. Ancient texts reference other works that have never been found. Catalogues from the Library of Alexandria list thousands of scrolls that vanished when the library burned, or when it gradually declined, or however it actually ended, since even the manner of its destruction is debated. What was in those scrolls? What plays by Sophocles that we've never read? What historical accounts that would change our understanding of the ancient world? What scientific treatises that might have accelerated human knowledge by centuries if they'd survived? The burning of Maya codices by Spanish priests is documented. Bishop Diego de Landa personally oversaw the destruction in 1562, burning thousands of texts because he deemed them works of the devil. Only 4 Maya codices survived, hidden or overlooked. 4. From a civilization that produced extensive written records, that had libraries, that documented their history and astronomy and mathematics and theology. Everything else burned, and with it went knowledge we can never recover. How they understood the cosmos, what stories they told, what insights they had achieved. Pregnant of heliocentric astronomy delayed scientific progress by generations. Copernicus published De Revolutionibus on his deathbed, knowing his ideas would be controversial. Giordano Bruno was burned at the stake partly for supporting heliocentric views. Galileo was forced to recant, spent his final years under house arrest. The knowledge didn't die. It couldn't. It was too robust, too evidenced. But its spread was slowed, its acceptance delayed, by institutional power that preferred comfortable falsehood to uncomfortable truth. Beneath the silence of what we've lost is the uncomfortable recognition that the impulse to control knowledge persists. It takes different forms now, not always fire, not always so obvious, but the instinct remains. The belief that some knowledge is too dangerous for people to have. The conviction that those in power are better positioned to decide what others should be allowed to know. The fear that truth, uncontrolled, will undermine the systems that maintain order. The scroll buried to survive the flames carries with it a question that has no final answer. What is worth hiding? What knowledge matters enough that someone would risk their life to preserve it, would choose burial over surrender, would trust an unknown future with texts that their present could not safely hold? And perhaps, as sleep approaches, we carry this question with us into dreams. What would we hide if the flames were coming? What do we know that we believe must survive? What truths would we seal in jars and lower into darkness, hoping that someday someone would find them and understand that they were worth saving? That knowledge itself, free, uncensored, dangerous and beautiful and true, is worth more than the temporary comfort of ignorance, worth more than the stability that comes from limiting what people are allowed to think. The jar waits in darkness, patient, silent, holding its secrets close. And somewhere, in some safer age or perhaps in this one, someone will find it, will break the seal, will unroll the texts and read words that were written to endure, that were hidden to survive, that speak across time with the voice of those who chose preservation over obedience, truth over safety, hope over despair. The flames come, but some scrolls, carefully hidden, carefully preserved, outlast the burning. And in their survival is a kind of victory, not complete, not without cost, but real. The victory of knowledge that refused to die, of truth that would not be silenced, of human consciousness insisting on its right to know, to question, to preserve what matters even when power says it must be destroyed. The darkness closes, the earth keeps its trust, and the waiting continues, some scrolls for decades, some for centuries, some for millennia, some perhaps forever, until the day when, if fortune allows, they emerge again into light and speak once more to a world that may finally be ready to hear them. At what point does history become legend and legend dissolve into myth? The border is not a line but a territory, grey, shifting, permeable as mist. We walk through it without noticing, crossing from witnessed truth to embroidered story to sacred narrative so gradually that no single step marks the transition. Yet the crossing happens. It has always happened, and somewhere in that murky zone between what occurred and what is remembered, the past transforms into something else, something that serves different purposes, carries different truths, speaks in a different language than the raw events that gave birth to it. We begin with Troy, because Troy is where the modern world learned this lesson. For centuries, the Trojan War existed only in Homer's epics, beautiful poetry certainly, but fiction, pure myth. The story of Helen and Achilles and the wooden horse was no more historical than Zeus hurling thunderbolts or Poseidon raising storms. Educated people knew this. It was settled. And then Heinrich Schliemann, armed with a copy of the Iliad and an obsessive conviction, began to dig. In the 1870s, on a hill in Turkey where Homer's geography suggested Troy should be, he found layers of ancient cities. Not just one Troy, but many, built, destroyed, rebuilt across millennia. The archaeology was crude by modern standards, the interpretation often over-eager, but the essential point was undeniable. Troy was real. A place Homer described as if it were pure imagination had actually existed, had actually been destroyed by fire and war, had actually been inhabited by people who left traces Homer's poetry had somehow preserved across the dark centuries when literacy was lost and knowledge was kept only in repeated verses memorized by singers who performed for their supper. Disagree established opened a door. If Troy was real, what else might be? What other myths might contain historical kernels? What stories dismissed as pure fantasy might actually be distorted memories of real events? The flood myths appear everywhere, not just in Genesis, where Noah builds an ark, but in Mesopotamian epics, in Greek legends, in stories from India and China and indigenous Americas and Aboriginal Australia. Different details, different heroes, but the same basic narrative. Catastrophic flooding, desperate survival, a world drowned and then reborn. For a long time, these were dismissed as coincidence or evidence of cultural diffusion. One story spreading and being adapted by different peoples. But then geology offered a different interpretation. At the end of the last ice age, sea levels rose dramatically, hundreds of feet in some regions, drowning coastlines where humans had lived for millennia. The process was not uniform or gentle. There were probably catastrophic events, ice dams breaking, glacial lakes emptying in massive floods, tidal waves from underwater landslides. Communities that had lived by the coast for generations would have watched the sea advance, would have been forced to retreat inland, would have lost everything to water that seemed to have no end. Is it possible? Is it even likely that the flood myths preserve these memories? That they are not fiction but history, transmitted through the only medium available? Story repeated generation after generation, embroidered and mythologized, but carrying at their core the witness testimony of ancestors who survived actual catastrophes. It is said that Atlantis was Plato's invention, a philosophical thought experiment about the dangers of hubris, not a real place. But the details Plato provides are oddly specific. And there was, on the island of Santorini in the Bronze Age, a civilization called the Minoans, who developed sophisticated architecture, art, writing, trade networks. And there was a volcanic eruption around 1600 BCE that devastated Santorini, generated tsunamis that would have struck surrounding islands, possibly contributed to the collapse of Minoan civilization. Could Plato have known fragments of this story? Could the tale of Atlantis, a powerful island civilization destroyed in a single day by earthquake and flood, be a distorted echo of the Minoan collapse? The dates don't match perfectly. The geography is imprecise. But memory across 1,000 years doesn't preserve precision. It preserves the emotional truth. That there was a great civilization. That it was powerful and advanced. That it was destroyed suddenly by natural catastrophe. That it sank beneath the waves and was lost. We move through these examples like detectives working a cold case, piecing together fragments, recognizing patterns, allowing ourselves to wonder if what we've dismissed as fantasy might actually be testimony. The Epic of Gilgamesh is literature, certainly, one of humanity's oldest surviving written stories. But Gilgamesh was a real king of Uruk, attested in the Sumerian king list. The epic story is fantastical. He befriends a wild man, journeys to fight demons, searches for immortality, meets the survivor of a great flood. But beneath the fantasy are descriptions of places that existed, kingship practices that match archaeological evidence, details of daily life in ancient Mesopotamia that are too accurate to be purely invented. Perhaps the story began as history, accounts of a real king's reign, his actual accomplishments, his personality and relationships, and then accumulated mythic elements as it was retold. Each generation adding something. He was not just strong but superhuman. His friend was not just loyal but magical. His journey was not just long but supernatural. Until finally, what started as biography had become mythology, but with the historical king still visible at the center, like a stone at the heart of a pearl. Whispers tell us of Aboriginal Dreamtime stories in Australia that describe coastal geography, bays, islands, land bridges that hasn't existed above water for 10,000 years or more. When sea levels were lower during the Ice Age, what is now underwater was dry land. Aboriginal oral traditions appear to preserve memories of this ancient landscape with geographical accuracy that stuns modern researchers. Stories about places that are now beneath the ocean, about when you could walk to what are now islands, about the sea rising and drowning the land. 10,000 years of oral transmission. How is that even possible? But the stories match the bathymetry, the underwater topography that scientists map with sonar. The myths describe a world that actually existed but vanished beneath rising seas before writing was invented, before any civilization we would recognize arose. The only way these memories could survive is through story, repeated with care across hundreds of generations, transformed into sacred narrative to ensure their preservation, but keeping at their core actual witnessed geography. Other oral traditions have pinpointed the locations of archaeological sites before formal excavation. Stories about where the ancestors lived, where battles were fought, where important events occurred, dismissed by scholars as legend, then confirmed when digging revealed exactly what the stories predicted. The Native American oral traditions that located ancient settlements. The Pacific Islander navigational stories that encoded real geographical knowledge. The African oral histories that proved accurate when checked against archaeological and documentary evidence. The emotional texture of these discoveries is complex, detective work and wonder braided together. There is the thrill of recognition, of seeing the historical kernel within the mythological shell, of realizing that our ancestors were not making things up, but preserving things, encoding real knowledge in story because story was all they had. But there is also sadness at how distorted the transmission became, at how much was lost in translation across centuries and cultures, and the slow mutation that repeated telling imposes. Beneath the silence of what can no longer be verified is the recognition of why humans transform history into myth. Partly it's practical. Stories are easier to remember than dry facts. A good narrative with characters and conflict and resolution sticks in memory in ways that dates and details do not. But it's also that humans need meaning, not just information. Myth gives events moral weight, cosmic significance, a place in the larger story of how the world works. An earthquake is just geology, but an earthquake sent by angry gods because humans grew too proud. That's a story that teaches humility, that warns against hubris, that gives the disaster meaning beyond random catastrophe. The transformation from history to myth is partly about preservation, but also about interpretation, about making sense of events that might otherwise be unbearable or incomprehensible. We imagine the gradual transformation across generations. An event happens, a real war, a real flood, a real king's reign. Survivors tell their children, "This is what happened, this is what we saw." The children grow up and tell their children, and in the retelling, certain details are emphasized while others fade. The third generation never knew the eyewitnesses, so the story begins to feel more distant, more flexible. Embellishments creep in. The king was taller, the enemy more numerous, the flood higher. The fourth generation adds supernatural elements. The gods were angry, the hero was blessed, the disaster was prophesied. By the 10th generation, what began as witnessed truth has become sacred story, and no one remembers that it started as something else. But the kernel remains. The war that started it, the flood that drowned the coast, the king who ruled and left such an impression that his name survived even as his humanity dissolved into divinity. The core event persists through all the transformations, like a fossil preserving the shape of something long dead. The emotional journey through this realization is one of recovery and loss simultaneously. We recover history from myth, extract the factual residue from the fantastic overlay, and in doing so, we touch something real. Our ancestors' actual experiences, their witness testimony, their attempt to preserve truth across the abyss of pre-literate time. But we also confront how much was lost in transmission, how thoroughly the original events were transformed, how difficult, often impossible, it is to separate fact from fiction with certainty. The border between myth and memory remains permeable, remains uncertain. We can identify probable historical cause in some myths. Others remain opaque. Are they pure invention? Or do they encode events so thoroughly transformed that we can no longer recognize the history within them? We don't always know. Can't always know. The past is not preserved with perfect fidelity. It is filtered through human consciousness, shaped by the needs and imaginations of countless tellers, transformed by the very process of transmission. And perhaps this is the final, quietest recognition. We are doing the same thing now, right now. Our current moment, which feels so immediate and factual and documentary, is already being transformed into story. Already being simplified, mythologized, fitted into narratives that make sense, but that necessarily distort. The events we're living through will someday be someone else's murky past, will be remembered imperfectly, will be subject to the same processes that transformed Troy from history into myth and back again. What stories will future archaeologists tell about us? What will they get right? And what will they misunderstand? What will survive? Our greatest achievements, or merely our most durable trash? What myths will they construct from our ruins, and how much of our actual lived experience will be recognizable within those myths? The border between what happened and what is remembered is always shifting, always uncertain, always permeable. We stand on both sides of it simultaneously, inheriting myths that contain history, creating histories that will become myths. The past speaks to us in a language that is partly truth and partly fabrication, and we speak to the future in the same hybrid tongue, unable to do otherwise, unable to preserve pure fact because facts without story don't survive the journey through time. Concealed. Perhaps this is acceptable. Perhaps this is how it must be. Perhaps myth is not the enemy of history, but its necessary companion, the vehicle by which events too old for writing or too important for mere chronicle travel forward to reach us. The shell around the kernel, the story that keeps the fact alive even as it transforms it. And as sleep approaches, perhaps we carry with us this understanding, that we live on the border between myth and memory, that every story we tell about the past is partly both, that the ancient myths we've inherited are speaking to us, if we learn to listen, in a voice that is distorted but not dishonest, transformed but not entirely invented, teaching us that truth can survive even when accuracy doesn't, that memory persists even when it can no longer distinguish itself from dream. Troy was real. The flood myths remember something true. Atlantis might echo an actual catastrophe. Gilgamesh was a king before he was a legend. The Dreamtime stories map a world that existed before the sea rose and covered it. And we are witness to events that will someday be myth, creating stories that will someday be excavated, living in a present that will someday be past, walking on ground that will someday be the border between what happened and what is remembered, between history and legend, between truth and the beautiful, necessary distortions through which truth travels when time is long and memory is all we have. In a cave in southern Germany, wrapped in earth that has held it for 40,000 years, there rests a hollow bone. Bird bone, precisely, a vulture's wing bone chosen for its length and straightness. Someone in the Paleolithic darkness carved holes into it with tools of stone, spacing them with care, testing the intervals, adjusting until the distances felt right. Until blowing across the opening produced not just noise but something else. Something deliberate. Something that might, if we stretched language past its comfortable boundaries, be called music. This is one of humanity's oldest instruments. Older than agriculture, older than cities, older than writing by tens of thousands of years. And it sits now in a museum case, silent. Not because it cannot sound, the hollow is still intact, the hole still precisely placed, but because we have lost the context, lost the songs it was meant to play, the ceremonies it accompanied, the emotional textures its melodies carried, the meanings that its particular intervals evoked in the minds of people for whom this bone flute was not an artifact but an instrument, a living part of their sonic world. Music is one of humanity's oldest languages, yet most of it has dissolved into permanent silence. Not partial silence, not muffled or distorted, but complete erasure. Sound, unlike stone or metal or bone, cannot survive unless continuously made. Every musical tradition that was not constantly practiced, that did not find new players and new listeners, has returned to the silence from which it came, leaving behind only instruments as artifacts of joy we can no longer hear. The discoveries accumulate across continents and millennia. Lyres pulled from Mesopotamian tombs in Ur, their wooden frames decayed, but their bronze and silver fittings intact enough to allow reconstruction. Bronze bells buried with Chinese emperors, cast with inscriptions that describe their intended pitch and ceremonial use. Greek pottery depicting musicians, fingers positioned on instruments in ways that suggest technique, breath, the physical reality of sound making. Egyptian murals showing orchestras, multiple instruments played together, hinting at arrangements, harmonies, the complex coordination that music requires when it becomes communal rather than solitary. We have the instruments, sometimes even notation, tablature for ancient Roman organs, neumes from early Christian chant, sophisticated systems in China and India and the Middle East that codified pitch and rhythm, and the subtle ornamentations that turned simple melodies into art. But so much context is lost. The instruments are silent wood and metal. The notation is marks on papyrus or stone. The actual sound, the thing itself, the vibrations in air that touched ancient ears and moved ancient hearts, is gone. How did they tune these strings? What did their scale sound like? The questions multiply. We can measure the holes on a bone flute and calculate what pitches it could produce, but calculation is not music. The intervals that sound consonant to our ears might have sounded wrong to theirs. The modes we find pleasing might have evoked entirely different emotions in minds shaped by different musical traditions, different cosmologies, different ways of organizing sound into meaning. It is said that in ancient Sumer, 4,000 years ago, mothers sang lullabies to children who would grow up to build ziggurats and write in cuneiform and trade with distant lands. What did those lullabies sound like? What melodies did Sumerian mothers hum as they rocked infants to sleep? Were they major or minor in our terms, or did they use intervals we would find strange? Were they simple or ornamented, slow or rhythmic? We have texts that mention lullabies, that even provide some lyrics, but the tunes are gone. The specific sequences of pitches and rhythms that made those words into songs have returned to silence. A Roman military march, we know they had them. Armies marching to the sound of brass and percussion, coordinated movement facilitated by coordinated rhythm. But what did it sound like? What scales did Roman military music use? What tempos? Was it intended to inspire courage or simply coordinate movement? Did it sound martial to them in ways that would resonate with us, or would it strike modern ears as strange, foreign, not quite what we expect from military music because our expectations are shaped by entirely different traditions? A Celtic ritual chant performed at winter solstice, when the year dies and is reborn, when druids faced a returning sun with voices lifted in whatever harmonies or unisons their tradition prescribed. Did they sing in octaves, in fifths, in intervals we would recognize? Or did they use the microtones that some traditional musics favor, the quarter steps between the steps we've standardized? Was it mournful or celebratory? Monophonic or textured with multiple voices? We will never hear it. The druids refused to write their traditions, and when they died, the songs died with them. The emotional texture of contemplating this loss is haunting, built on the recognition that sound is ephemeral in ways that other arts are not. A painting fades but persists. A sculpture erodes but maintains form. A text, if copied, can survive millennia. But sound exists only in its sounding. Stop making it and it ceases completely, as if it had never been. Most of human musical expression has already ceased. The thousands upon thousands of songs and chants and instrumental pieces created across pre-recorded history are gone as thoroughly as if they had never existed, leaving behind only descriptions, depictions, and the mute instruments that once gave them voice. Fragments remain, but fragments are not the thing. Ancient Greek texts describe the different modes, Dorian, Phrygian, Lydian, and attribute to them specific emotional and ethical qualities. The Dorian mode was considered masculine and martial. The Phrygian was passionate, potentially dangerous. The Lydian was soft, suitable for certain contexts but not others. But what did these modes actually sound like? We can reconstruct the intervals. The Greek theorists were precise, but the sound itself, the actual sonic experience of hearing a melody in Phrygian mode played on an ancient aulos, is something we can approximate but never truly recover. Pedestrians' ragas offer another example of music as cosmology. Each raga is not just a scale but a complete framework. Specific notes, specific ornamentations, specific emotional textures, specific times of day when it should be performed. Some ragas are for morning, others for evening, others for midnight. Some evoke devotion, others longing, others joy. The system is ancient, refined across millennia, and it survives, but in surviving it has changed. The ragas performed today are descendants of earlier traditions, not identical to them. What did a raga sound like 2,000 years ago? We can study the oldest texts, but texts describe rather than preserve. The actual sound is lost. Chipotrator's pentatonic scales organized not just music, but philosophy, emotion, cosmology. The 5 notes corresponded to the 5 elements, to directions, to seasons, to emotional states. To play music was to engage with the fundamental structure of reality, to bring sound into harmony with the larger patterns that governed existence. But what did this sound like in practice? We have bronze bells from the Shang and Zhou dynasties that can still ring, but the ceremonial context in which they were used, the complete musical pieces they were part of, the other instruments that accompanied them, these are gone. Whispers tell us of attempts at reconstruction. Ethnomusicologists studying surviving traditional musics, looking for continuities, for practices that might echo older traditions. Archaeoacoustics, the science of measuring how ancient performance spaces would have affected sound. Amphitheaters, temples, caves where rituals were performed. Their acoustic properties persist, tell us something about what sounds would have been enhanced or muffled, suggest what kinds of music might have been performed there. Scholars painstakingly decode ancient notation systems, trying to translate marks into sound. Sometimes successfully. Early medieval chant can be approximated from neumes, though details of rhythm and ornamentation remain disputed. Ancient Greek musical notation on surviving papyrus fragments can be converted to pitches, though performance practice, how the music was actually played or sung, remains largely mysterious. Modern attempts to reconstruct ancient instruments are themselves a kind of archaeology. Craftsmen studying museum artifacts, measuring dimensions, analyzing materials, trying to recreate not just the physical object but its sound. A reconstructed Mesopotamian lyre doesn't just show us what the instrument looked like. It lets us hear something approaching what it sounded like, though without the original strings, without knowing exact tuning methods, without the technique of ancient players. The approximation is necessarily imperfect. Beneath the silence of what cannot be recovered is a deeper mystery. What did these musics mean to their creators? How did a shepherd's pipe in ancient Anatolia evoke feelings in listeners shaped by entirely different cultural contexts, different cosmologies, different ways of understanding what music is and does? The intervals that seem exotic to us might have felt natural to them. The rhythms we find complex might have been their equivalent of simple folk melodies. Music is not just organized sound. It's organized sound that carries meaning, that evokes emotion, that connects to memory and identity, and the deepest structures of how we understand ourselves and our place in the cosmos. And that meaning is culturally specific, learned, embedded in contexts that don't survive when the music itself dies. We can reconstruct the sound, approximately, but we cannot reconstruct the meaning. We cannot hear with ancient ears, cannot feel with ancient hearts shaped by ancient experiences. Priceless emotional journey through this recognition moves from curiosity through melancholy into something quieter, a kind of peace perhaps. Acceptance that some arts are truly ephemeral, that impermanence is not a flaw but a feature, that sound's inability to survive its own sounding is part of what makes it precious. Every performance is unique. Every moment of music is unrepeatable. And when a musical tradition dies, when its last practitioner stops making its particular sounds, it is gone as completely as a breath, leaving nothing but description and memory, and eventually not even memory, just the artifacts, the instruments, the notation, the depictions that testify something was here, but cannot tell us exactly what. Parachute. This is appropriate. Perhaps there is something right about music being the most ephemeral of arts, the one that must be continuously remade or it ceases entirely. Perhaps the silence that has swallowed most of human musical expression is not tragedy, but inevitability. Not loss, but the natural consequence of time's movement and sound's fundamental temporality. Negligence capable with the wind moving through a hollow bone in that German cave, making sounds as air passes through holes carved 40,000 years ago. The sounds are not music, not intentional, not played, but they echo, across vast distance, something humans once deliberately created. The breath that once gave this instrument voice is gone. The fingers that covered and uncovered its holes are dust. The ears that heard it, the hearts it moved, the ceremonies it accompanied, the meanings it carried, all return to silence, but the holes remain. And the wind, indifferent and eternal, sometimes finds them, and for a moment, brief, accidental, meaningless in the way that only natural phenomena are meaningless, sound emerges from the bone. Not the music that was intended, not even close, but sound nonetheless, a pale echo of the deliberate beauty that once existed here. A whisper from silence suggesting that once, long ago, someone made something beautiful with breath and bone and care. Something that filled the air and moved hearts and then stopped, as all sound stops, leaving only the instrument and the wind and the vast silence where music used to be. Jimmy, and perhaps, as sleep approaches, we carry with us this understanding. That beauty does not require permanence to matter. That the songs we cannot hear were real when they sounded, were precious to those who made and heard them, fulfilled their purpose completely even though that purpose is now unfulfillable. That silence is not emptiness, but a space where sound once was, where it might be again, where the possibility of music persists even when the music itself does not. The wind continues, the bone remains, and in the space between them, in the accidental sounds that emerge when conditions align, we might hear, if we listen with imagination rather than ears, the faintest echo of something our ancestors made, something that carried across centuries not as sound but as intention, as evidence that humans have always made beauty from breath, have always organized sound into meaning, have always sung and played and listened, knowing or not knowing that their music would die with them, making it anyway, because the joy was in the making, and the meaning was in the moment, and the silence that would follow was simply the silence that follows all things, permanent and patient and complete. There are places where the ground itself seems to hold its breath, where stone has been arranged not merely to enclose or shelter, but to mark something more profound. A threshold between worlds, a boundary where the familiar ends and the sacred begins. These are the ancient gateways, the doorways built to facilitate passage from one state of being to another, from the known into mystery, from life into whatever comes after. In the high desert of southeastern Turkey, on a hilltop called Göbekli Tepe, humanity's oldest known temple complex rises from earth that has held it for more than 11,000 years. There are no walls here, no fortifications, no signs of habitation. Only circles of massive T-shaped pillars arranged with deliberate geometry, creating spaces that feel simultaneously enclosed and infinite. Each pillar weighs tons, carved from bedrock and transported by methods still debated, their surfaces decorated with animals rendered in relief. Foxes, serpents, scorpions, birds. Pedestrians is older than agriculture, older than cities, older than writing. Built by people we call hunter-gatherers, though that term seems inadequate for minds capable of conceiving such a project, such a vision of sacred space. They carved these pillars, arranged them in circles, created thresholds that still, after 100 centuries, evoke the sensation of standing between earth and sky, between human and divine, between the mundane world and whatever realm these circles were meant to invoke or honor or access. We begin here because Göbekli Tepe reminds us how ancient the impulse is to mark transformation with physical passage, to build gates that separate not just here from there, but now from then, us from them, this state of consciousness from that one. The circles create boundaries, and boundaries create meaning. To step within them is to enter a different kind of space, governed by different rules, open to different possibilities. The narrative must move through time now, following this thread, the sacred threshold, across continents and millennia, recognizing the pattern that repeats because the human need it serves repeats, never fully satisfied, never fully resolved. In Egypt, the passages into pyramids align with stars, not symbolically, literally. The king's chamber's air shafts in the Great Pyramid point to specific stellar destinations. Orion, associated with Osiris, and the circumpolar stars that never set, associated with immortality. To enter the pyramid was to follow a path literally oriented toward the heavens, to move through architecture that encoded astronomical knowledge and theological conviction, to pass through progressively smaller spaces, the grand gallery narrowing, the antechamber descending, until finally the burial chamber, enclosed, dark, silent as only stone buried beneath thousands of tons of stone can be silent. This was a gate to eternity, designed to facilitate the pharaoh's transformation from mortal king to immortal god. Every detail mattered. The orientation, the proportions, the decoration that shifted from earthly scenes near the entrance to cosmic symbolism in the deeper chambers. The architecture was theology made manifest, an argument in stone about the nature of reality and death and what lies beyond. It is said that at Newgrange in Ireland, older than the pyramids, older even than Stonehenge, a passage grave built more than 5,000 years ago demonstrates a precision that seems almost obsessive. The entrance is oriented toward the winter solstice sunrise with such exactitude that for a few minutes each year, only then, only at that angle, sunlight penetrates the darkness of the inner chamber, illuminating the back wall with light that has traveled through 17 meters of carefully constructed passage. Imagine being inside that chamber on winter solstice morning. You have entered in darkness, moved through the narrow passage in darkness, stood in the enclosed space where the dead were placed, where bones mingled in the stone womb of the earth. And then, at the moment when the year itself is reborn, when the sun begins its return toward longer days and warmth, light enters. Not flooding, not sudden, but gradually, deliberately, traveling down the passage like a living thing, like breath, like revelation, until it touches the back wall and for a few precious minutes transforms the tomb into something else. A temple, a calendar, a demonstration that death is not ending but transformation. Darkness not permanent but cyclical. The gates of Mycenaean fortresses, carved with protective lions, declared to all who approached, "You are entering a place of power." The lions were not decoration but warning, promise, theology. They guarded the threshold between the chaotic world outside and the ordered world within, between the realm where strength mattered and the realm where lineage and divine favor mattered more. To pass beneath them was to accept the jurisdiction they symbolized, to enter space governed by different authorities than mere physical force. Japanese torii, those distinctive gates that mark the boundary between mundane and holy ground, function similarly. They announce, beyond this point, attention is required. Respect is expected. You are leaving the ordinary world and entering territory where the kami dwell, where different behaviors are appropriate, where transformation is possible if you approach with proper awareness. The torii does not bar passage. Anyone can walk through, but it marks the threshold, makes it visible, reminds you that passage itself is significant. That moving from outside to inside is not neutral, but meaningful. Whispers tell us that humans have always needed to mark transformation with physical passage. We do not transition well without ritual, without visible signs that something has changed. The gate provides this. It creates a before and after, an outside and inside, a profane and sacred. In passing through it, we acknowledge that we are moving from one state to another, that the rules that governed us on one side do not necessarily apply on the other. The psychology of thresholds is complex, ancient, possibly innate. We hesitate at doorways. We pause before entering unfamiliar spaces. We mark life transitions, birth, adulthood, marriage, death, with ceremonies that often involve literal passage, through doorways, under arches, across boundaries. The physical movement embodies the psychological transformation, makes visible what would otherwise be internal and uncertain. Pensions. The emotional texture of approaching these ancient thresholds is one of reverence and slight unease. These places were designed to inspire awe, to make visitors feel small, to remind them they were crossing into territory governed by forces beyond human control. The narrow passages force humility. You must bend, must proceed carefully, must leave behind the swagger and certainty that the open world allows. The sudden opening into vast chambers creates relief and wonder simultaneously. The oppression of the narrow way released into spaciousness that nonetheless remains enclosed, controlled, purposeful. Darkness punctuated by calculated light is a common feature. The tomb entrance that admits only certain angles of sunlight. The temple chamber that remains in shadow except during specific ceremonies when lamps are lit in prescribed order. The passage that moves from light to light again, taking you through a symbolic death and rebirth simply by walking. The decoration that shifts as you move deeper, from earthly scenes to celestial symbols, from realistic depictions to abstract geometries, from the familiar to the cosmic, teaching through imagery that you are leaving one realm and entering another. We imagine the processions that pass through these gates across centuries. Initiates entering mystery cults, led blindfolded or in darkness, not knowing what awaited, trusting or fearful or both. Undergoing transformation that the gate's passage embodied and facilitated. Pharaohs being carried toward eternity. The final journey from palace to pyramid, crossing the threshold from life to the architectural argument about what comes after. Sliding into darkness with the conviction or the desperate hope that this was passage rather than ending. Pilgrims approaching oracles, passing through gates that mark the boundary between the everyday world where human wisdom sufficed and the sacred precinct where the gods might speak through chosen vessels. The dying being brought to tombs they would never leave, the living who carried them respecting the gate that separated this world from whatever lay beyond, knowing they could pass through and return, but the one they carried could not. Beneath the silence of these stones is the understanding that architecture itself was theology. Not illustration of theology, not housing for theological activity, but theology enacted in physical form. These gates were arguments about reality, about what lies beyond the visible, about the proper relationship between human and divine. They asserted that boundaries exist, that sacred and profane are not the same, that some spaces require different consciousness, different behavior, different expectations than others. The symbolism built into these structures rewarded careful attention. Narrow passages forced humility, but also created anticipation. What lies beyond? Sudden openings into vast chambers demonstrated that constriction is not the final state, that passage through difficulty leads to expansion. Darkness was not merely absence of light, but meaningful state, preparation for illumination, whether physical or spiritual. The decorations that shifted from earthly to cosmic taught through immersion, through the experience of movement, that transformation is gradual, that leaving one realm and entering another happens step by step, symbol by symbol, threshold by threshold. Perhaps these gates remain powerful because they acknowledge something true about human experience, that we do cross boundaries, internal and external, that our lives are punctuated by passages from one state to another. Birth to childhood to adulthood to death, ignorance to knowledge, ordinary consciousness to whatever lies beyond it in dream, in trance, in the moments when the self feels permeable and the boundaries between inner and outer seem less certain. The gates mark these passages, make them visible, give them weight. They suggest, or insist, that transformation is not casual, that crossing from one state to another deserves recognition, ritual, reverence, that the moment of passage itself is sacred, worthy of being held, contemplated, honored. The chapter must end at a threshold, not beyond it, not fully in the sacred space, not behind it, not retreating to safety, but at it, in the liminal moment, neither inside nor outside, holding the suspension between states, recognizing that this is where the power lives, not in either realm, but in the crossing between them. Some gates remain open across millennia, still marking boundaries we might choose to respect or cross. Göbekli Tepe's circles still create enclosed space that feels different from the surrounding landscape. The pyramid passages still point toward Orion. Newgrange still admits the solstice sun. The Torii still mark the boundary between mundane and sacred, even if fewer people pause before crossing, even if the awareness has dulled but not disappeared. Pardon, perhaps what these gates teach is that boundaries are permeable but real, that sacred and profane are not the same, that transformation requires acknowledgement, that passage deserves ritual, that the moment between states is itself a state, worthy of recognition and reverence. And as sleep approaches, which is itself a threshold, a passage from waking consciousness to something else, from day self to night self, from the world of doing to the world of dreaming, perhaps we stand at our own gate, one that opens only when shadow comes, when light fades, when the day's certainties dissolve and consciousness prepares to cross into territory governed by different rules, inhabited by different presences, where transformation happens whether we understand it or not. The gate waits. It has always waited. Built by hands that understood that some passages deserve marking, that thresholds between worlds are real and should be respected, that architecture can embody theology, that stone arranged with intention can still, after millennia, remind us, you are crossing a boundary. Be aware, be reverent. Transformation awaits if you choose to continue. If you step through the gate that opens only in shadow, only in the sacred moment between states, only when you're ready or willing. to leave one world and enter another, carrying with you nothing but the awareness that passage itself is sacred, that gates mark not barriers but invitations, that beyond every threshold lies something unknown, something that requires courage to approach and wisdom to honor, something that has waited since humans first carved circles in stone and understood that sacred space begins where ordinary space ends, at the gate, at the threshold, at the place where transformation becomes possible and passage becomes prayer.